ゲームじゃない感じに仕上げたいっていうような、ゲームなんですけど、ゲームやってたっていう感じよりもなんか違うものが残ってほしいなっていうような、感覚ですかね。僕ほら、例えばゲームっていろんなものがあるし、スポーツゲームもあれば、パズルみたいなのもあるしっていう、そういうものの、なんていう要素をもう何でもかんでも吸収しちゃうようなゲームなところがあるので、ゲームをしてるんだけれども、いろんなことの体験をしてって最後にその物語全部が集約し、一つ終わりを迎えるみたいな、そういうような遊びともつかないしゲームともつかないし、何だったんだろうこれは、なんかその疑似体験としてなんか面白いものを経験しちゃったなみたいな、そういう感覚で終われるものになってくれればいいなといつも思ってますね。だからゼルダは何でも吸収できるし、何をやってもゼルダとも言えるし、うまいことをやらないとゼルダと言ってもらえないみたいな変な側面もあるし、なんかね、変な不思議なゲームです。はい。
Eiji Aonuma's 5 directed Zelda games are a very over-discussed topic, like, in general. For reasons that we're going to get into, it's important to a lot of people to control the narrative about them, which you might also suspect this video is going to be an attempt at. What I would say is that these games are not perfect. They've got filler and problems. Even if they didn't, the medium is still very young, so making grand declarations about it wouldn't be enduring or impressive. So for the longest time, I never felt the need to say anything. But I realize now that most Zelda fans understand small surface level things, but in the end, they just can't see the forest for the trees. The director's intended interpretation ends up getting the same amount of focus and respect that some fan theory would. They like it, they think it's fun, but optional. Some people still believe it to be unfounded. Nobody's as angry as they really should be. They seem to think that everyone is just entitled to their opinion, which is textbook cowardice. I thought that I could organize things a little better, but I really can't afford to. I promise by the end of it, I really do address everything, but I won't explain it in ludicrous detail, because I'm not trying to sell you on a stupid fan theory. None of this is a theory. It's not apologetic in any way, and it isn't my opinion poorly disguised as a retrospective. This is simply The Legend of Zelda as it was intended by Eiji Aonuma. Now before I say anything about anything, I need to address all the common misconceptions that I possibly can. For Zelda, the very best source of misconceptions is Matthew Matosis, a painfully condescending YouTube critic.
The story sets itself up to be a prequel to every other Zelda game to date, but doesn't accomplish anything with it. The most shocking revelation in the game is that Zelda is actually the reincarnated form of the goddess Hylia, a character who had never even been mentioned before until the intro to Skyward Sword.
Starting with the basics, the very first Zelda timeline was published in this Famitsu article in 1991. Eiji Aonuma was hired in 1988, but wouldn't join the Zelda team until the absolute earliest, 1996. A Link to the Past is mostly Takashi Tezuka's game, but the game's manual was written by Koizumi, who would later go on to co-direct the 64 Zeldas and direct the first 3 3D Mario titles. So the timeline in this article is most likely by Koizumi.
Okay, so you've got Zelda 3 at the top, and then it says the original Zelda makes her first appearance. And then it also says Link's ancestor, ? Then after that it just says Nagai Nengetsu, I think, which is just like a long period of years and months. That's all it is.
It's interesting here that Koizumi is saying A Link to the Past is a time jump prequel to Zelda 1. Aonuma must have really loved this idea, because when he was brought on, he repeated it. Twice. When we get into later the boundaries of Aonuma's creative control, this will be an important thing to go back over because it shows the line between what he inherited and how he retooled it to fit his purposes. In 2002, following the release of The Wind Waker, Aonuma would give this quote in a GamePro article. The GamePro article itself is lost to time from what I can tell, but it's been archived in this issue of Nintendo Power. Where does The Wind Waker fit in the overall Legend of Zelda timeline? In terms of the storyline, we've decided that this takes place 100 years after the events in Ocarina of Time. We think that as you play through the game, you'll notice that the beginning of the story explains some of the events in Ocarina of Time. You'll also find hints of things from Ocarina of Time that exist in The Wind Waker. There's also a more complicated explanation. If you think back to the end of Ocarina of Time, there were two endings in that game in different time periods. First, Link defeated Ganon as an adult, and then he actually went back to being a child. You could say that The Wind Waker takes place 100 years after the ending in which Link was an adult. Now that's pretty descriptive on its own, but if you need proof of his consistency on this issue, he says a similar thing in Nintendo Dream number 154, which was transcribed and archived to Ninja.com in 2006. Fair warning, I can't read Japanese, and Google Translate doesn't handle this very well. Windtact is parallel. Isn't it back to the childhood when Link flies to the world 7 years later at Ocarina and defeats Ganon? Twilight Princess is a world 100 and several years after a peaceful childhood. In the last scene of Ocarina of Time, Link and Princess Zelda come back as children to have a conversation. It is this story that the story's result is a little dragging that the relationship between the three with Ganon goes in different directions. In the middle of the work, there's a scene where Ganon is executed. If you leave him alone, he will be executed because he is a sacker to do ridiculous things later. So that scene is a few years after Ocarina. So the executed Ganon was sent to a world and this time trying to get that power. There's plenty of old message boards of people reacting to the Famitsu article getting published elsewhere, most famous of which is AVGN's video, which he published on Cinemassacre.com in 2009. It's so weird to me that timeline deniers nowadays try to retroactively say that the chronology was somehow made up for Hyrule Historia in 2011. It's something that Aonuma had discussed for 2 decades at that point, and everybody else at the time was clamoring about it. It's probably the easiest lie to disprove that you could think of. I also found a Reddit post showing a magazine from October 2011 out of context in order to say that the timeline still isn't official. Meanwhile, Hyrule Historia released in December 2011. So it was a secret in October, but by December it was no longer a secret. I don't think that anyone actually bought this one, but I thought I would mention it while we're here because it's pretty funny.
At the start of the Minish Cap, there's an opening sequence detailing a previous incarnation of Link and shows that he wasn't wearing a hat. In the grander scheme of the Zelda timeline, the Minish Cap was basically an origin story for Link's hat, which was a fun idea. It was executed extremely well, and by the end of the game it was nice to know that the hats of the various Links worn through the years were a sort of unknowing tribute to Eslo. Skyward Sword undoes the entire point of this game. If Skyward Sword actually cared at all about being faithful to the timeline, then Link wouldn't be wearing a hat, which would have been an extremely easy change to make, and might have even made his design more interesting.
I won't get into this too much in this video because we're focusing on Eiji Aonuma's directed Zelda games and his story intentions for them. But yes, he does include games on his chronology that he had zero involvement in, and that much is a little confusing, understandably. I'm not going to say that these games aren't canon to each other, but if you think about it, or even if you don't, there's no possible way that these games could ever have any significant story connection. That's not what the timeline is about. The timeline is about how Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword all would connect to Ocarina and Majora. As Eiji Aonuma developed his story, these were the only parts that he was really concerned about. There's 100-year time jumps between each hero, stretching 200 years, and the implication when you create any story with time jumps is that the events in between aren't significant. Nothing can happen after Ocarina of Time for a while because Ganon is sealed away, and etc., etc. So these other games on the timeline, again, I'm not saying they aren't canon, but they are superfluous, which is supported by the fact that nobody ever mentions the Minish or Vadi or any of that stuff. None of this is confusing as long as you have a basic comprehension of time travel and you don't poke holes in it like a contrarian.
If they use the same logic as the Song of Storm scenario, then the plants would always be grown in the future because the game would assume that young Link would plant them in the past. If the Song of Storm scenario worked by the logic used on the plants, then the guy couldn't possibly have taught Link the song in the future until young Link played it in the past. Basically, all of this is to say that the time travel in Ocarina of Time probably wasn't thought out to a huge degree, and the developers simply went with whatever they thought was a good idea for certain parts of the game. When you look at the Magic Beans and the Song of Storms, they're both good ideas and I like the way they play with the time travel. The problem is they're incompatible with each other.
What Matthew really wants when he says that Minish Cap is a better prequel than Skyward Sword is for fans to be able to make creative changes to the story, and not the person directly responsible for that story. And well, that's problematic.
The reveal that Tetra is Zelda is perhaps the least thought out moment in any Zelda story ever. As soon as she's revealed to be the princess, the King of Red Lion starts referring to her as Zelda for no reason. Presumably names in the Zelda universe work the same way they do in the real world. Presumably Tetra has been going by the name Tetra for as long as she's been alive. It's even left ambiguous about whether or not she knew about her heritage at all, so why then is she suddenly renamed Zelda as soon as she discovers her lineage? This alone might not seem so bad, maybe we could assume that her name was Zelda all along and Tetra just an alias, but her clothes are suddenly replaced and she seems to undergo a complete personality change. She's no longer a freewheeling, aggressive pirate, but suddenly seems to be a refined, caring princess. Even if we go out on a limb and assume that Zelda's personality somehow awakened inside of Tetra, then that's a pretty terrible fate in and of itself. It's as though Tetra was just a vessel to be overwritten.
Does it not occur to Matthew that just because an event takes place later in the story, that doesn't necessarily mean that the storyteller came up with it later? I mean, think about it. Even if you don't know anything about Zelda, this information is obviously important to the ending of the game. He says that this moment isn't thought out, but he doesn't provide any evidence for that claim. Does he know who created the story? Can he provide evidence that they didn't think about it? Obviously not. He's just saying that to him, the scene doesn't feel like it was thought out. By definition, this can't be a shoehorn if that's what he always planned to do. I mean, it's made up, but everything's made up. So yeah, Tetra isn't real, Zelda isn't real. These are fictional stories. Again, what is this guy even talking about?
The more likely answer is this is simply a shoehorned reference to Ocarina of Time, one of many that are in the Wind Waker for seemingly no reason at all. There's no time travel in the Wind Waker, Link has no connection to the previous one apart from his clothes, the game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. Overall, the references to the Hero of Time and all that stuff feel pretty forced, and the Koroks and the Rito are the two worst examples. The idea of setting a game and was essentially a post-apocalyptic scenario of Hyrule is wonderful, but its attempts to continue on from Ocarina of Time seem incredibly half-assed and not very well thought out.
It's pretty inappropriate to say that the races in Wind Waker need to have firmer connections to their Ocarina counterparts in order to be a fitting conclusion to the story. Their connections are loose on purpose. They had to endure the onslaught of a reawakened Ganon and then a giant flood. It's completely believable that they'd lose the majority of those ties. Actually, this is just a total misunderstanding of not only the plot, but also the themes and morals of the game. The point that Aonuma is trying to make with the Wind Waker, generally speaking, is that you should accept the past for what it is and build a better future. All the people, Hylians, Rito, Koroks, they've shed their connections to the old world, and now live in peace above the waves, just as the gods wanted. Ganon insists that this was a cop-out, and that the gods refused to save their people, but it's not true. They did what they could. Ganon's whole motivation in this game is to destroy the new world in wake of reviving the old one. He's trading all of his tomorrows for a single yesterday, and defending himself to the detriment of the rest of the world. And you don't need an art book recapping that information to understand it properly. It's explicitly told to you in dialogue. And again, none of this is a fan theory. It's just what's in the games. Going back to what I said earlier about extraneous titles, Matt even complains about Phantom Hourglass for this very reason.
The ending to the game sees Hyrule washed away with the kids' future left in their own hands. We know now that the story continues on in two direct sequels to the Wind Waker, those being Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, but taken on its own, I think this would have made a fitting ending to the entire Zelda saga. Games could have still been set before the Wind Waker to allow the series to continue, and some are, but the Wind Waker itself would have made a nice conclusion to the series as a whole. Ganon, Hyrule and the Master Sword are all lost beneath the waves, and life moves on. It would have made for a nice ending.
And he catches it here. But again, he's only applying this logic when it suits his opinion.
It would almost be as incredibly stupid as the King of Hyrule passionately telling the children at the end of the Wind Waker that their new land won't be Hyrule, because he wanted the past washed away. And then, within a few years, they discover a new continent. Guess what they call it?
Adding any kind of character depth or world building or some other literal element, you might take that as an improvement to the story, but actually it makes it less concise. Instead of it being about this emotional tug and pull about the morality of family versus future, you're erasing that and just boiling Hyrule down into any other fantasy world that you would use to escape your adult responsibilities. The point is instead to take these morals to heart and apply them to your adult life. Lorne Lanning, I think, is one of the first game developers to actually take himself seriously. In the 90s, he was forced to make a bunch of games out of contract, but now that he's gotten out of that contract, he's finally self-publishing, so he can take his time between releases. Most developers, like Eiji Aonuma for example, don't have that luxury, because the authority of an artist's influence on a work is considered a threat to the authority of a corporation who only sees art as an entertainment product. Which is especially pernicious in computer games, because the entire industry right now is centered around the idea that games are only escapist toys. When Lanning conceived Oddworld basically as a movie, he turned the idea into a video game for budgeting reasons.
That's amazing. Let's make 5 movies. And I was like, no, we're going to make 5 games because 5 movies is going to cost at least $500 million. And who's going to give us that? Nobody. But we could get maybe $25 million to make 5 games at less than $5 million a piece. And she was like, oh, you suck. You're just like, I just have no interest in making games. I win awards and I make movies and I love films and games is just violence and it's this and that. I was like, games is a lot of things and it's going to be a lot more things and you don't really know. None of us can tell what it's going to be yet. But ride this with me for a second. This is what's going to happen. These systems are going to come in. It's going to change the medium. And you know what? The medium of games, they don't know how to do large productions yet. They don't know how to manage 150 people on a team, but we do. So we have that going for us.
Executives don't expect as much out of game devs as they do movie directors, which afforded him a lot of leniency. Some would probably be offended by the idea that games could be treated as though they were low-budget movies, but this approach allowed him to pioneer, while also cheating his homework off of the movies that he really liked. I'm not going to say that presentation isn't important, because it is important, but as far as getting your foot in the door, most people will just take what they can get. The people who end up pushing the frontier of technologies, in the beginning they were just industrious storytellers who wanted to have their story told by whatever means necessary.
Brought a whole nother level of depth of understanding to the environment.
Yeah.
You know, and which always inspired the work. And you asked, what's the creative process to the work? So the creative process for me really comes back to a problem to solve. If we can look at this world not in such a fearful way that everything I do every day isn't just driven to put food on the table and pay my mortgage, but is actually in the pursuit of something greater, some greater possibility. Then for me, that greater possibility was how do we unlock this crash course that we're on? And to me, that's eventually, I don't mean to sit here with philosophical positions and politics and stuff, but
I'll steer you back to the brain, don't worry.
okay.
Don't worry.
But to me, that was, we have all this tremendous inertia behind failing models. One would just be capitalism, right? So we'd say, how do we, I chose not to have kids, not because I didn't want kids, but because I didn't worry about the kids. I didn't want to worry about kids because I didn't think that we'd make it on the planet. And so we'd say, well, that's a problem. How might we solve that problem with whatever tools we as individuals have? And the only tool I felt like I had was really art, was visual arts. And so in the beginning, with visual arts, I was drawing and painting guys with axes and like the rest of them, and dragons and Lord of the Rings type of stuff. And it was really artists that unlocked my mind, when I started arriving in New York and getting around serious heavyweight intellectuals. They'd be like, well, that's really interesting, but where's the beef? What's behind this? What's your purpose? Why? Are you just masturbating and putting something up there because it's fun and you go, look what I could do, look at my talent? Or do you see problems with the world that you might use art to address in some way?
The people who end up pushing the frontier of technologies, in the beginning they were just industrious storytellers who wanted to have their story told by whatever means necessary. They're just trying to get their point across, the story, of course, being the ultimate point.
I'm not fond of the heavy emphasis on story in Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, as I think it all too often breaks up the gameplay and gets in the way of the whole reason people play the games in the first place. The story never really should be the draw, just a little something to urge the player on.
Because when I talk at length about why the story in The Legend of Zelda is so important, I'm not talking out of my ass. This is the entire reason Eiji Aonuma became a developer. This is the entire reason most people become artists. It's the singular thing that they wanted to do. So yes, Zelda games exist as stories first, and games second, which, by the way, isn't a flaw, it's a strength.
All the references to the Hero of Time and all that stuff feel pretty forced. Its attempts to continue on from Ocarina of Time seem incredibly half-assed and not very well thought out. Then that's a pretty terrible fate in and of itself.
What Matt is really trying to say is that he believes that there's no way Aonuma could have possibly cared or kept track of all these things, but as I'm gonna show, Aonuma absolutely did keep track of the details. Speaking of details, let's look at another character who has his true identity revealed to him.
This section of the game is where the Zant stuff finally goes off the rails. He had only been seen rarely before this point, but he was shown to be a restrained and creepy villain who managed to be pretty intimidating. Had they kept this up, he could have easily substituted as Ganon for the game's main villain. Zant's character is flushed down the drain in the space of a minute, and it turns out he's just another boss to defeat on the path to the real villain, Ganon. I don't think there was any point to establishing Zant as a villain at all if he was going to be replaced at the end of the game with Ganondorf.
I'm not going to harp on it too much right now, but you should at the very least understand that all fictional characters are nothing more than metaphors, and they are, in fact, at the disposal of the larger story.
Freewheeling, aggressive pirate, strained and creepy villain who... It's as though Tetra was just a vessel to be overwritten. Zant's character is flushed down the drain.
This isn't a flaw, it's just how stories have been told for thousands of years. A fun, unique side character is never going to take precedent over the larger story. I'm going over many interview quotes later, of course, but you don't have to know the entire history of everything to understand that Eiji Aonuma is the originator for these story concepts. That much is self-evident if you simply read one or two interviews, because he's always the one that gives detailed and lengthy answers to story questions, talking about things he could only know if he was.
Tetra allows Link to get on board the pirate ship, and by this point you've probably figured out that she's Zelda. In Ocarina of Time they pulled this trick as well, but it was far more unexpected because Sheik was so different from how you would imagine Zelda to be, and because they hadn't had a twist like that before. Nobody who played Ocarina was about to be fooled twice. It's not a big deal, but it begs the question of why they even bothered, or why they didn't try to do something a bit different. This is a tough balance to maintain, however, and after the complaints from some people that Majora's Mask and The Wind Waker were too different, it was probably inevitable that Nintendo would eventually produce something too close to the Ocarina of Time mold. Back in the days of Ocarina and Majora, Nintendo clearly didn't care about crafting an overarching timeline for the Zelda series.
As I've been showing, at no point in these videos does Matt have any curiosity about the storytelling purposes of anything. He has a hunch that Tetra being Zelda wasn't thought out, but he never did any research, or he would find out that he was wrong. He also has a hunch that Tetra and Zant were originally meant to carry over into the third act of the story, replacing Zelda and Ganondorf, but he never did any research, or he would have found out he was wrong. And he keeps droning on about how Nintendo did this or Miyamoto did that. He's just making it abundantly clear that he has no insight on who actually came up with the story that he hates so much. The only way that anyone could miss important details like this, like Tetra obviously always being Zelda, or Zant obviously always being Ganondorf's heir, is by completely missing the intended reading of the text, which you can either do unintentionally, because you misunderstand the story at face value, or intentionally to mislead people even though you actually do understand the overarching story. Now, which one does Matt fit into? You might be shocked.
According to the story, the world was formed by three goddesses who are also responsible for creating the Triforce. This story has no bearing on the game in the slightest and could have been swapped out with any mystical backstory you could think of. We don't get any reason why the Triforce itself would exist, just that it was left behind after they were gone. These events are so far removed from the things that actually happen in the game that they might as well have not been included. I'm all for fleshing out the world, but this doesn't tell us anything about Hyrule or any of the people living in it that we didn't already know. It just confirms that some goddesses made the world, not a big deal.
Now, I could nerd about this, but then he skips over the part where Zelda recaps it later. And then when Ganon seizes the Sacred Realm, like they had been talking about the entire time, he says this.
The Ocarina of Time opens up the Temple of Time, where the game will skip forward 7 years into the future. There's a bit of an unnecessary cutscene where Ganon tells how this was his plan all along, blah blah blah, and then a bit more exposition.
Just as it was in Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, none of this stuff is optional to the story of Ocarina of Time. Matt wants to have his cake and eat it too, where he can ignore the story, because according to him it doesn't matter, but then when the story reaches a climax, and suddenly all of those things do gain relevance, suddenly it's this weird thing that comes out of nowhere. The truth is, it never came out of nowhere. Matt just wasn't paying attention. Like, check this one out.
But this is just one element of a much larger game, and regardless of how you feel about the visuals, it's worth considering how well the Wind Waker stands up as a Zelda game, and as a game in general. It starts out on the appropriately named Outset Island with
No, it doesn't start on Outset Island. I mean, you know full well that it doesn't. This intro explains all the supposed problems that Matt has with this story, and this is on the GameCube version, where you can't even skip the cutscenes, so you've had to deliberately edit that footage out of your recording. I can't believe people take this guy seriously when he thinks that he can make a 40-minute video claiming to have some kind of insight on The Legend of Zelda. Meanwhile, every single blasted thing he says about the story doesn't contain any information in it. Matt, not only are you missing the entire point of the whole story, you're doing it on purpose. You know what the story is. You've proven that you know.
We're told that Ganon has basically won. He's got his hands on the Triforce and took over the Sacred Realm. Link got sealed away for 7 years so he could grow old enough to take him on. From here on out, most of the game is played as adult Link in the future, and it's a great idea for the plot. In most action-adventure style games that revolve around saving the world, you're given some idyllic place that needs protection, or a post-apocalyptic world where the struggle of the people compels you to try and help them. Either of these scenarios can only be so effective because we're left wondering about what exactly it is we're trying to prevent, or what exactly it is we're trying to restore. As soon as you walk into Hyrule Town 7 years on, Ocarina of Time has answered both of these questions. You have an immediate comparison in your mind of what Hyrule should look like, and what it does look like now.
You have very good reading comprehension. Just because from Tetra's point of view all of this is mysterious, that doesn't mean the player doesn't know who Zelda is. Tetra wasn't alive 100 years ago. She obviously doesn't know who Zelda is. That doesn't mean that this moment is out of character. We, the audience, do know who Zelda is. Her name's on the title screen. The only reason you wouldn't apply this logic to the Wind Waker is if you were being deliberately disingenuous to serve your opinion.
You have an immediate comparison in your mind of what Hyrule should look like and what it does look like now. The game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. What Hyrule should look like. The game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. What Hyrule should look like and what it does look like now. Well, not as we know it anyway. And what it does look like now.
But as previously established, the moral at the end of The Wind Waker is that you should accept the past for what it is and build a better future. Twilight Princess, being an alternate ending to the story, is now inverting that moral. Now, Link is the one protecting his heritage and saving his family, and Ganondorf is the one creating a future for himself in spite of his past. The shoe's on the other foot, but interestingly, Ganondorf is still in the wrong. This is the thematic purpose behind the timeline. At this point, I really have no patience for the people who pretend like the timeline is inconsequential or confusing, because its purpose here is obvious. Twilight Princess is a poetic inversion of Wind Waker. That's the whole reason that they're both sequels to Ocarina of Time. Now you're able to explore, on an emotional level, both sides of the same coin. It's fun and interesting, and it's very sad that a lot of people just can't be bothered. But anyway, how does Eiji Aonuma pull all this off? Well, Zant is the key here. Notice that Zant doesn't have to beg Ganondorf for powers or anything. Ganondorf actually comes up to Zant. Let's think about this for 2 seconds. Why Zant? Well, Zant must be special, right? Remember how Tetra is the next Zelda after her mother? Well, here, Zant is the heir to the Lost Gerudo Patriarchy. He's the third male Gerudo after Groose. Once again, this stuff would be totally obvious if Matt simply read the text on screen. You know, thank God it's actually on screen this time. If this was really a retrospective, like it says in the title, wouldn't it contain information that Matthew would only have access to in retrospect? You know, like an art book that explains the story in black and white detail. But no, just to make sure he's been contrarian to every single point made by Hyrule Historia, since that's the true reason he made these videos, he's going to insist that Zant was always supposed to be the main villain of Twilight Princess. With no evidence, mind you. I mean, seriously? I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but you don't have to make fun of these videos. They just make fun of themselves.
It may be a case they only made this decision because they knew many players would be replaying the game and thus would be ready for hard mode, but I hope they seriously consider this for the next Zelda. At the end of the game, you're taking on multiple Darknuts at once, who do several hearts of damage if they manage to connect.
There's a concerted effort by Matt to overgeneralize and downplay everything, not just the story. He's constantly acting like he's too good for the game. And if that's how you feel about video games, that they should have to earn your attention and respect, you know, that's a matter of personal taste. You can like whatever you want. But don't delude yourself into thinking that attitude makes you superior to everyone else. Now, like I said, most fans these days already know most of this. Matthew is a huge outlier. But at the end of the day, even the fans who are aware just aren't seeing the bigger picture. So we need to keep zooming out. And there's a huge prerequisite before you can truly appreciate Twilight Princess as the first proper revision to Zelda's chronology.
Oh man. Yeah, I think this is going to be a fun playthrough. Anyone here never see this? Also, thank you for the host, Mike. Hi, everybody. Oh, so there's a lot of people who have never played this game. I think you'll enjoy this. This is going to be one of those playthroughs I think you might remember for a little while. Not because of me, but because of the game. It's just one of those games. So, really nice look at the world. For anyone who's getting Legend of Zelda vibes, it's a pretty damn different game, aside from just a couple of visual similarities and sword. And horse, and bridge, and castle. And bow, and climbing. Oh, and Zelda is in this. And Link. And Epona. And Ganon. Alright, I'll stop.
Fumito Ueda is intentionally pulling from Eiji Aonuma in multiple important points in both Ico and in Shadow of the Colossus. And Eiji Aonuma is intentionally pulling from Fumito Ueda in multiple important parts in Twilight Princess, in Skyward Sword, and even as early as The Wind Waker. So, no, Vinny, their similarities are not superficial. Ico was essentially a love letter to Ocarina of Time, and Shadow of the Colossus has a load of distinctly intentional references to Majora's Mask. Aonuma's referencing Ueda as a reciprocation of Ueda's own references to him. This is about two artists coming to an emotional agreement about something. The comparison currently on screen alone proves that they were not only good friends and have a strong relationship, but that they were actively bouncing ideas off of one another and making notes in each other's margins. Comparing side by side like this isn't revealing something shallow like their favorite flavor of ice cream, it's corroborating evidence of their authority in their own work. The big one that I always think of is this one, the spiral staircase inside the tower. Aonuma wants you to think about Yorda from Ico, and he wants you to compare Yorda in that game to Zelda's role in this game. a pale, fragile girl hiding in the shadows. And that's exactly why Ganondorf's first phase is fighting Zelda as a puppet.
娘应给我一些，娘谁困就死呢？走开，ひにょさしいをこんさ。
我丢来了了都，来个给老一点。
In Ico, Yuita was comparing the queen to Ganondorf, specifically from Ocarina of Time. The queen is Yorda's helicoptering mother, who won't let her daughter leave the house, and she's molding her daughter into becoming a younger version of herself. Yuita wants to show that love can be just as damaging as hate, if you're possessively loving and you don't let your children be their own people, or in Wander's case, if you try to cheat death by making a deal with the devil, he's also possessive with his love. Aonuma poetically agrees with these sentiments and has his parental figure in his game, The Wind Waker, be exclusively about that. Aonuma's talked about that several times, about how he made The Wind Waker for his son, and that Toon Link was meant to be an analog for his son. We're going to come back around to that later. These kinds of connections apply to the Twilight Princess too, but I'm talking about Wind Waker here because I think it's an easier and more obvious example, but really Twilight Princess is obvious too. Zelda fans are just incredibly dense. I mean, some of them have suggested, like, as a fan theory, maybe the Gerudo could have turned into the Twilight, but no, they haven't accepted that this is the intended interpretation. They haven't accepted that this is a fact. I mean, I know it's not everyone, but a lot of people, including Vinesauce, or Vinny, he's watching the pre-Lake Bed Temple flashback and assumes that these interlopers are some new race of people that we've never heard of. I'm not joking, he actually takes the explanation for the series' largest retcon at face value.
I don't remember any of that stuff. Okay.
By extending the
I don't remember any of this.
They don't get that Midna's hair color is meant to be reflective of Twin Rova. They don't get that Midna's dialogue before the fight reflects what Naboru tells you as a child. And they especially don't understand that Zant being a male Gerudo and wanting to reestablish the patriarchy is what all of this dialogue was always about. There is a pretty good video by Max Darrett where he talks about all the Gerudo's dark magic stuff, and how in both Zelda and in Ico, there's a focus of this dark transformation magic and body horror. But again, most of that is the bleeding edge of the fandom, and even he doesn't get into everything. But it bears repeating that none of this is a fan theory, and it's not inconsequential. It's the way that the director of both Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess intended the audience to interpret their connected story, also known as canon. It's a fact. It is not a mystery. It's not even hidden. It's required for understanding the story properly. It's ridiculous that I should even need to say that, because these games, in full reality, they're not even that dense with story. These stories are moral lessons meant for children. If you just pay basic attention, this is the only way that you could interpret it. The game is practically preaching it at you. The characters explicitly tell you all this shit in dialogue. Now, unfortunately for Yuita, most of his games, the cutscenes are written as silent movies, so you don't need dialogue to be able to follow the story. But Onuma's games require dialogue because of his background. We are getting to that later, like I said. Don't worry, we're almost there. But you can tell, like, even down to a plot level, all these connections are important. Like, how Ganon is taking girls to the Forsaken Fortress because they have yellow hair. That's just like how Ico is taken to the Queen's Castle because he's a boy with horns. Yuita is deliberately putting you in the shoes of outcasts from cultural stigmas in his games. And, you know, those ideas of sacrifice to ward off evil are pretty essential to Shintoism. And any media-literate adult should know that Shintoism isn't important to anything created in Japan. As you can see, Ico's connections to Zelda and Zelda's connections to Ico are not optional pieces of this analysis. Even in Vinny's case, I actually don't think he meant to say that Ico and Zelda aren't connected. What he really meant was just for chat to not watch the gameplay expecting Zelda, which is a good primer.
For anyone who's getting Legend of Zelda vibes, it's a pretty damn different game, aside from just a couple of visual similarities.
But as Vinny's watching Shadow of the Colossus' intro, you can hear the moment where he recognizes the Bridge of Elden quote.
And sword. and horse and bridge and castle.
I don't know how you missed the Lostwood stuff from like 5 seconds ago, but that's not the point. It's very obvious in his tone. He just immediately ate his own words. But rather than apologize and admit there's something he could learn here, he just turned it into a joke instead.
Oh, and Zelda is in this. And Link. And Epona. And Ganon. Alright, I'll stop.
This was an opportunity. A moment where Vinny could have educated his audience on something he picked up on. Seriously. Shouldn't it matter that Vinny plays video games for a living? Like, if someone's gonna call this stuff out, shouldn't, of all people, that responsibility fall on someone like him? It's not like it's that hard to figure out. This doesn't just apply to Vinny. If you play Nintendo games for a living, and you didn't know that Zelda takes cues from the Ico series, I'm not going to say that that's okay, because I don't think it's okay. These ideas don't come from nowhere, and they're not meant to seem like they do. The only reason Nintendo fans don't know any of this stuff is because all their gaming experience exists in a bubble.
I feel like right now in the early days of Switch, that's what you're seeing, is that there's people who have the Switch and are hungry for
but
games
how many?
to play.
Well, how big is it?
The
How big
audience?
is the audience?
Exactly.
What is it? 2 million units?
2 million.
yeah,
is
right,
what
'cause that's what they wanted
the
to hit
original
by.
launch
Yeah,
would have
yeah.
been.
So let's take 2 million units,
Yeah.
right? Now, do you ever sell in 10% of the installed base?
Supposedly, Switch has a crazy attach rate with the
Well,
with
that's because
Zelda
there's
and then,
so few available. One of the
Yeah.
highest IPs of all time, right? Nintendo first party will deliver IPs that the Nintendo audience is just frothing for, right? So they'll have the highest attach rate of any new console
Yeah.
with their own specific IPs, Zelda and Mario. No, really, who really by the end of the life of the Wii, who else was making money on the Wii aside from Nintendo? How many titles sold for the Wii that weren't Nintendo first party?
Sure.
Okay. So what happened? So they started basically evaporating third-party support, right? Then we get to Wii U. What happened? Same.
No third parties, yeah.
So there could be some advantages for some people, but overall it's going to add up to the same thing. Smaller portfolio on the library, period. At the end of the day, the catalog is going to be this when it could have been this. You would have thought that maybe if there's no games for sale on a network, if people have a hardware device, maybe they'd like to know that a game has become available.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that, in a silly me.
Yeah.
If you grew up with Nintendo, there's a good chance you never leave Nintendo, and more crucially, there's a good chance you never actually grow up. Instead of complaining that Skyward Sword was boring, what people at the time should have said is how bold it actually is. And no, I'm not saying that out of any bias whatsoever. This is one of the key things that holds video games back from being appreciated as narrative art, because all the art intellectuals think that video games are nothing more than toys, and all the gamers are apparently only interested in the toy-like qualities of the games they play. Credit where credit is due, when Vinny streams a Zelda game, he does play it correctly, slowing down and making sure to read all the NPC dialogue like signposts.
Like a Twilight Princess. Shit, hang on.
So despite being a viewer of channels like AVGN, Narrow, or Matthew Matosis, Vinny's been immune to all the big common misconceptions, which makes him an excellent example for this section.
It goes like this. Alright, there's 3 separate timelines that branch off of Ocarina of Time. So, here's how it goes. I want to explain because it's very interesting. I just learned some more little details in Hyrule Historia. So, 3 different timelines. In one of the timelines, when Ocarina ends, Link goes back to being a child. That's the ending that we see. Zelda tells the king, they find out that, Ganondorf was a cunt, and they decide to get rid of him. Many years down the road, they execute him. That's in Twilight Princess. But here's what happened to Link. Link wandered off into the forest without a fairy. And, Navi didn't get lost. Navi flies away. At the end of Ocarina of Time, Navi just flies away. And in the beginning of Majora, you see that Link is looking for a friend. And he's obviously in the woods. And it's highly speculated that say if Majora did happen, let's just say it did, if it was real, if there really was a parallel universe that Link went to and returned from, well, that Link was forever forgotten. No one knew about the Hero of Time. No one celebrated the Hero of Time in this particular timeline. Just to further add to that, in Hyrule Historia, it's directly stated that the Hero of Time, was never to be seen or heard from again after Majora's Mask. And his regret over that, as it states in Hyrule Historia, allowed him to be the swordsman whose sole purpose was to teach the new Link of Twilight Princess the moves that he knew as a way to pass down his legacy. So the hero is successful, and the adult era, Ganondorf is revived, Hyrule is sealed and flooded. Because the hero wasn't even around, I don't think. I have to read into that a little bit more. I haven't gotten to the Wind Waker section yet. I know it's a little bit to wrap your head around, but it is exceedingly interesting. So, isn't this stuff really interesting? Like, I love this stuff, the theories. And it seems like Majora was the deepest and had the most psychological stuff going on there. So, and there you go. Tingle is a representation of Link. Tingle is a mutation of Link. Because he's a 40-year-old man dressed as a fairy. Which again is representative of the...
When I watched this in 2015, I was enthralled. I had a lot of fun revisiting Zelda with Vinny's Wii U streams, and then playing them on my own. At the age of 14, I hadn't played Skyward Sword yet, and I hadn't read Hyrule Historia, but I did watch Vinesauce, and that was my introduction to all this. I'm gonna criticize a popular streamer, but know that I do so with peace and love. I really don't think that Vinny is stupid, although he can be impatient sometimes. You can see here that when he applies himself, he's actually an enormous asset to media literacy. I'm also not the first person to ever complain about his reactionary approach to really just any game outside of Zelda that tries to be story-driven. It's not irrelevant either. There's a large example that I'm going to get into soon, but first, I just want to fully concede something. Yes, this is about loyalty and authority, and I'm going to address that directly before I talk about said example. Just because fiction isn't real, that doesn't mean that it's a lie or that it doesn't mean anything. In the end, art is what you make it out to be. If you're not receptive to it, you won't understand. If you laugh at it like it's a joke, then that's all you're allowing it to be for you. That's your choice. So to understand something from the perspective of the person who created it, you do have to drink the Kool-Aid. At least a little bit. But I think this is such a sticking point for a lot of gamers, not just Vinny. They've latched on to this false idea of player autonomy and quote-unquote freedom. That feeling you get when you're perfectly immersed in an artist's world, it's not freedom, it's surrender. There's only one correct way to play a video game, and when you do, you feel free. You feel like your actions are your own. And that feeling is, in fact, important. The player has to have control over certain small actions. It's something unique to the medium of games. Only in a game are you able to fully and completely immerse the audience in the role of your protagonist. But that really isn't a goal in and of itself, it's just a means to an end. Video games are curated experiences. At no point is the player in control of what context their small actions can be applied, because if you do something unintended, we understand that to be a glitch and not part of the design. Instead, the artist is in control of the context, which is why level design is crucial. It dictates the entire grammar of how games talk to you. There's just no such thing as a linear game. Terms like gameplay first and open world are not genres. They're marketing buzzwords, and they always have been. If you're somebody who truly enjoys open world level design, I have to stress that you aren't being entertained by an artist's imagination. You're just caught up in your own. Gamers today have this assumption that storytelling is somehow foreign or isolated from gameplay. It's an assumption you can't square with reality, though. If you actually read the interviews of Eiji Aonuma, Lorne Lanning, Hideo Kojima, you learn that they were all involved in their games intimately and as a whole. There's no notion that gameplay and story are separated in their development process in any way. And more than that, it should be commonly understood that when you're an artist, you have an idea, and you design around that idea. All of your designs are influenced by your idea. Most of the effort on the part of the artist is to continually bring their designs back to their core idea. It's not really as strange or as convoluted as it's made out to be. It's just standard practice. The standards weren't always this way, of course, but for the game developers that I keep mentioning, they all got their start in game development in the PS2 era, after games went 3D, and was the moment that video games finally stopped being only for nerds. If you want to know exactly why games weren't seen as much before the 90s, Lorne Lanning was there. He can tell you why.
What was also on the horizon was Sony PlayStation. So Sony was saying, we're going to get into the game business. And that was kind of out there a couple years before the PlayStation launch, at least. And that's when I thought, this is really going to get interesting, because for the first time, we're going to have a real, true entertainment company get into the game business as a player, and not just a toy company. And that's how I saw Sega and Nintendo, was toy companies. And I don't mean that in any derogatory or condescending way. I just meant they saw their market, and they didn't believe in things like sequels. Check this out, right? So we're going around and talking to game publishers and stuff, and I'm trying to tell them how we're going to build a series, and we're going to, because I'm just following, like, what does X-Files do? What did Disney do? What did the sequels? This is all Hollywood's about. In games, they were thinking, and this is in 1993, 94, 95, they're going, there's no money in sequels. The sequel only sells at best half as much as the original hit, so we don't really bank on it. And I saw that, I was like, there's one of our moments. There's one of my George Lucas, Walt Disney moments. They don't believe in sequels, which means they don't believe in brand, which means they still thinking about it like it's the toy industry. You know, you come out with Cabbage Patch Kid, but you can't milk it to death, right? Barbie lasts forever, Hot Wheels last forever, Legos lasted forever, but everything else tends to be largely come and go. So the toy industry thought more in this way of, you come up with a toy, if it can be a hit, you ride it, you milk that cow for all it's worth, and then you got to come up with a new one. And games was still thinking that way.
It's like I said earlier, this is the entire reason that people like this became artists and became developers. It was always what was most important to them and what they wanted to do with their lives. In all of these cases, the consistent problem isn't that they made the game too cutscene heavy or they were trying to balance everything to the satisfaction of the audience. The problem that they were actually faced with is that they couldn't tie their designs back to their ideas in the way that they wanted to, either because the hardware wouldn't support the actions or scenarios that they wanted, or because corporate overseer didn't want them to do it for an entirely arbitrary reason. As time goes on, the artist has more respect, the industry standards improves, and technology progresses to the point where they can finally execute their vision. From what the artists have been able to accomplish with their later work, you can just immediately understand that games like Abe's Odyssey, Ico, and the first Metal Gear are all extremely unfinished games, and their sequels don't fare any better. So even though we can go back now and point to these early titles as early signs of a particular artist, the studio really had more control than they did. The only thing salvageable about the game is that it partially belonged to the game's director. But even though the game has those elements, these games really don't accurately reflect the artists that truly made them. As a direct result, the audience who gained an attachment and became fans of their earliest work, when they couldn't do what they wanted, almost always develop mistaken impressions. And this is a prevailing issue. It doesn't just apply to specific fans from specific series. In the 80s and 90s, this is all that video games were, because it was all that video games were allowed to be via company mandate. Even nowadays, it's rare that any console-exclusive character is allowed to be anything more than an empty mascot. In a marketing sense, you just aren't allowed to make a video game for the sake of making a video game. It's only supposed to be as a piece of promotional material for the new movie or whatever. When really any series finally escapes this vacuum of corporate greed and is finally true to the intentions of a real artist, the audience doesn't reward them, even though this is an obvious victory. Instead, they ungratefully punish the artist, like seriously, every single time that this has happened. If I really went into every single example of this video would be easily 3 times longer. All these quote-unquote fans just come out of the woodwork to say, hey, this isn't a shallow toy like the previous games, what the hell, this must be some kind of mistake.
This one is a sequel to Ocarina of Time, but wait, not a sequel to the end where adult Link defeats Ganon, no, it's a sequel to young Link after he got sent back. So now, any speculation of Nintendo ever making a sequel to Zelda 2 is deader than shit.
This clip of James Rolfe is a perfect example. James wants a direct sequel to Zelda 3. He wants a story that continues in one direction. That was never going to happen, though, because before Ocarina of Time, the story of Zelda that was being told was nowhere near deep enough to actually support a continuing story. Each Zelda title basically existed in replacement of one another. They were explicitly not 3 chapters in one story, and they weren't trying to be. During development, Tezuka and Koizumi in their earliest work together kept trying to run away from continuity, not embrace it. That's not because they didn't want to tell stories, it's because they didn't want to get attached and deal with the inevitable loss when they were told no to their ideas.
They don't understand yet. It's going to be brand IP and sequels. But that means it's got to be deeper, richer universes. And in the shit you're currently delivering, I understand why you don't believe in sequels. Because that story sucked. No one gives a fuck about your story because it sucks. If it wasn't good play, your character sucks because you don't have any character development. And so I was very critical of what the characters were in games. Not that I wasn't enjoying them, but when you put it up to a Hollywood standard of character development, character arc, what's happening across the multi-act structure, you had a whole different analysis of what constituted a popular character. So does Mario turn into a good movie? It's a fucking terrible movie, right? It's a terrible movie because it's not there to begin with, right? Does Ratchet and Clank make a good movie? I love Insomniac. Why would you make a movie out of Ratchet and Clank? How deep is the fabric of those characters? How many other game movies did we just give no depth that we expect from movies? So they brought to the movie the same superficiality that's in the game, except what they had the game going for it was good challenge. Now it's just a challenge to watch, right? So for me, I was like, if we build really rich characters with really rich, deep stories that aren't what you expect, so they have the ability to possibly cut through, then they might have a longer life. And as the game industry matures, then maybe they can hit the big time. Then maybe they can, really have their name in lights.
What James really wants when he says that he wants a sequel to Zelda 2 is for things to go back to the way they were. He wants a sequel that doesn't try to tell an actual story. When games finally went 3D and lost that technological edge that this kind of fan never shuts up about, you actually didn't see many retro gamers lamenting the loss of their favorite series. What rose in popularity instead were people like JonTron or Egoraptor, where, again, because they grew up playing video games, they don't actually feel the need to do any research. The jump to 3D was, just some kind of coincidence or happenstance. It's just growing pains, guys, don't worry. Meanwhile, the entire industry was in flames. People lost their jobs over this. It wasn't a joke. And now, actually, because of the damage done to really criticism as a concept, it's going to take a long time before we're corrected from these mistakes. We've got our work cut out for us. What this actually reveals about retro gamers is that they truly never cared if these story elements were always there or if they were consequentially important. What these types of audience aren't willing to admit is that they're automatically hostile to the mere concept of there being an overarching story in the first place.
I'm glad that Zelda, Ganon and Hyrule are all absent from Majora's Mask, because after Ocarina of Time, there was no need to revisit Hyrule and no story to be told there. Any direct sequel would need to be told somewhere else in order not to weaken the impact of the events in Ocarina.
The sad truth is that this mass exodus was extremely avoidable, and it never required publishers to delay the jump to 3D or postpone it indefinitely. 3D was not the problem. It was a symptom of the fact that publishers just didn't want storytellers to tell their own stories.
There are plenty of famous actors and directors who've lent their names to movie-like games, but Oddworld's co-founders Sherry McKenna and Lorne Lanning are from a world of special effects and theme park rides. They left behind big budgets and state-of-the-art equipment because they never had full control of a project.
When you are the vendor, the client thinks that they know more than you do about what you're basically doing. So you'll have the suits come down and say, yeah, that looks great. Can you make it blue? And so basically, my whole career has been spent listening to other folks tell me how to do what I'm supposed to be an expert at doing.
Lorne Lanning is an exception in the scenario, not in the fact that he's dealing with these problems, but in the fact that he's allowed to talk about them. Eiji Aonuma and Hideo Kojima would have had to keep their mouths shut, or it would have cost them their jobs.
Most of the development community, not the game buyers, but the development community said 3D is what's going to make better gameplay. Well, they're wrong. And game players today know that they're wrong because they've got 100 games on a shelf that aren't as good as many of the games they used to play in 2D. 3D is not that important right now. Eventually we'll go 3D, but right now what's important is making better gameplay, and that's where so many people have missed it entirely.
The only thing that publishers really should have done was give gamers a reason to play these games other than pure mechanical satisfaction. But of course, they would never do that, because it would mean removing their authority as parasitic bureaucrats. Even down to a marketing level, publishers in the 80s and 90s just didn't treat video games like a real product unto itself. It was always only as a means to other ends. We very trivially know this, because it's true in every single industry.
And someone sent in that one about too many Chinese cooks spoil the broth.
Why is that's I don't know who slipped the word Chinese in there, but I heard it as too many cooks.
Well, it was just all sort of Chinese proverbs and that.
One of my favourite on the same subject is a camel is a horse designed by committee. And if you wanted to design a horse and you had that vision, but you let 12 people in the room have their say, it wouldn't come out as you wanted it to do, and it wouldn't be as good. A vision is more perfect than committee, because everyone having their say, it becomes anodyne, it becomes compromised. Whereas the best things you can do is have an idea and have a vision and auteur that.
Rick, can I just say now, I can tell from his look that he's thinking, which committee designed the camel?
Well, even today, this is still a major factor in development. Even in games that are unique properties for a console manufacturer, those properties exist to create mascots for the console. Only secondarily are the characters attached to stories, which is why Lorne Lanning was so frustrated with this precedent in the industry.
So does Mario turn into a good movie? It's a fucking terrible movie, right? It's a terrible movie. Because it's not there to begin with.
Obviously, when we look at these clips, we can't know for sure what's happening in Vinny's personal life. But more than that, I respect that my relationship with Vinny has always been a parasocial one. I don't know the guy personally, regardless of how many nights I stayed up watching or how many weird things I sent to him. I will encourage you, please come up with your own conclusion. Even though I won't hide mine. Now, in a previous draft of this video, I tried inserting full clips, but what I found was that it ended up being way too long and most people didn't want to watch it. But I'd like to assure you, as best I can, that I'm not taking Vinny out of context. The longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be for me to prove that I really don't care if Vinny likes Death Stranding or not. During part 3, he explains that why he's not streaming the rest of it, and it's actually a very valid and reasonable explanation.
Glad you're still enjoying playing this. Yeah, it's fun. It's fun. This is exactly how DS1 sunk its claws, but this game does it way smoother. It starts immediately, too. Like, as soon as you get to the first delivery, you're already, you're doing all the different things. You're doing combat. You can choose to do combat. You can choose to do the deliveries how you want. Something about it really just was so fucking weird. Those first cutscenes, I'm like, ugh. But now, I'm less concerned about that, and I'm just kind of going with it. Maybe the game played a trick on me. Maybe it's doing it better. I don't know, but I'm enjoying it more, like a lot more. And again, the walking simulator thing that people say for this game, like, yeah, we talked about that earlier. It's a real thing that you just do a lot of walking, but it's just got a really addictive gameplay loop. But it definitely, yes, it sunk its teeth in, and the hooks are in. The game is cool. I appreciate some of the stuff it's doing, and I'm having fun with it. I mean, again, you just saw me stream like 3.5 hours of it, 3 hours, whatever it was, and I just had a really good time. So, cool game. This is also a long, like, large open world game. After me playing a large, long open world game, yeah, Oblivion. So, I'm not going to guarantee I'm going to come back to this, just because that makes it a little easier for me to make decisions. I just don't want to get people's hopes up that, like, oh, Vinny's definitely going to play more of this. Maybe.
I think it's normal to try new things, and Vinny obviously doesn't have a legal obligation to do a complete playthrough of every game he does. Of course, it would be nice. I think that if I was in Vinny's position, I'd feel lucky to be able to play video games for a living. The thing is, though, it's his life, and I don't have a license over someone just because I watch them a lot. I think I'm going to start with what I think is my least relevant point. This quote from Norm Macdonald is being misappropriated.
Video games are side quests for real life. It's kind of funny you say that. There's a Norm thing that really sticks with me. Norm gambling. I want to get it right. A psychiatrist once said that I gambled in order to escape the reality of life. I told him that's why everybody does everything. Kind of true. Like I said earlier, like the idea of the sun burning out, my cousin trying to scare the shit out of me. And it's like, you know, what am I gonna do? Like, go to my parents and be like, you told me the sun's gonna burn out, and what are they gonna do, lie to me? Like, it is. It never happened, so I just had anxiety is the problem. But I just kept thinking about, like, dying and the sun and, like, like the universe and gamma rays. And then I got to a point where I would just be like, oh, I'm going to play Zelda. Fuck it. Who cares?
Norm is, of course, a comedian. So he doesn't always mean what he says because it's a joke. I'm going to pull a little more context just to show what I'm talking about.
I remember a psychiatrist once telling me that I gamble in order to escape the reality of life. And I told him that's why everyone does everything. But I've had plenty of wasted nights after losses and bigger losses to consider the question more seriously. So why the attraction? Most people would think it's the wins that keep the gambler going, but any gambler knows this is not true. As you place your chips on the craps table, you feel anxiety and impatience.
Oblivious1 tweets, I would love hearing anything about Norm's amazing gambling run in Atlantic City.
Oh, yes, that's what happened. A friend of mine is very smart said, I've been very lucky with gambling. I've never won. And it was a very profound thing, you know what I mean? Because if you never win, you don't get hooked.
When the red dice hit the green felt with a thunk, and you're declared the winner, and the chips are pushed toward you, you feel relief. Relief is all. And relief is fine, but hardly what a man would give the whole rest of his life to gain.
In most of Norm Macdonald's jokes, and really his whole brand of comedy, he's presenting himself as an unreliable narrator. When Norm's telling a joke, you're meant to see his logic, but not endorse what he's saying, not literally, anyway. So, no, Vinny, Norm is not endorsing or excusing addiction. That's also not what he thought about his gambling addiction. Norm is playing a character, someone with an addictive behavior so deeply rooted that they refuse to believe the world has any other meaning than their addiction. Of course, the best lies are based in truth. This is something that Norm experienced. Just because he's expressing it here doesn't mean that he doesn't see the irony in it. And in fact, now I've explained the joke to the point where it's not funny anymore. Although, to be clear, I don't think the irony is lost on Vinny either, but whether or not Vinny realizes it, he's coming to this conclusion for a specific purpose. When Vinny is endorsing hedonism like this, just to be clear, that is what he's doing, he isn't doing it because he's stupid. He's choosing ignorance as a way to cope with a situation that is genuinely terrible.
How long until next Chrono Trigger playthrough? When's the next election? Apparently I play it every 4 years now. It's true though, it's weird. I've been playing it, like, pretty much exactly... Maybe just to escape from the bad and just enjoy. You know what I mean? Just to, like, feel some, I don't know, some semblance of normalcy. Because, I mean, even if, whatever side of the fence you're on, it becomes a fucking circus, and it just becomes exhausting and negative and horrible. So, you know, enemies become friends, friends become enemies, and all that. You know what I mean, Brian?
He's not stupid, he's willfully ignorant. And there is a difference. All of this feeds into a philosophy Vinny has about personal sovereignty, and for a while I actually respected it. It's only recently that I've come to learn how dangerous it is to be this detached.
Do you have any advice for an unemployed person struggling? OnlyFans? No, I don't have any. If you want a real answer, I was trying to think of a real answer, and that's the only one that came to mind. I would say don't lose hope. As much as possible, try not to. But I don't know what the job market is like in 2025 compared to 2007 when I was out of college. But I applied to fucking everything. And eventually, oh, finally some light armor that doesn't look like... You know, if you hang in there, I didn't know what I wanted to do, genuinely. We talked about the potential for teaching. Even that, I don't think I would have been good at that. I've explained this story a bunch, but yeah, I didn't expect streaming to become anything. There was no money in streaming. Streaming was nothing. It was just like a hobby. All of that stuff seemed unattainable, and I didn't have the drive. So what I wanted to do was just find a job to make money, and then drink on the weekends. Thank you for entertaining me on my boring Saturday nights. These hot messes keep me going. Well, they're fun. I don't always want to go out. You know, like I used to go out on the weekends more, and there's just nothing to do. I'm not really a big drinker anymore, so it's like, well, what do? I'd rather stream.
You know, these are really good optics if you've decided that you don't want to contribute to society in any meaningful way. Look, I'm not stupid. I know that the situation, with American politics especially, is very much beyond discussion, and it's an understatement to say that it's been that way for some time. I subscribed to this thinking for a long time. Plenty of very rational people are scared. And it's rational fear, too, because there is real, observable danger. I'm criticizing this thinking now as someone who used to feel that way, and as someone who still kind of feels that way, even though I realize that it's wrong. It's hard not to feel that way. But at the same time, it's not hard to figure out that just because something is popular does not mean that it's productive or that it's valid.
They withdrew into the remaining cities, which in turn closed their doors to outsiders. People ceased to travel and stopped meeting in person. They grew distant from one another and became further isolated. The social, cultural, and political bonds between humans began to crumble.
No, Chad, that's not a metaphor.
Understand, Sam?
I do respect Kojima's, like, thing that he's going for with this game. Like, connecting people together. I think it's nice.
This is Tom, man.
Funny enough, living in an openly hostile, distrustful, and seemingly hopeless world is exactly what Death Stranding is about. Which is not completely lost on Vinny, but I still think it's worth bringing up Kojima's points on this subject. This first comes into focus in Death Stranding 1 with the junk dealer and the chiral artist's daughter, and culminates when you receive an interview titled An Asexual World. If we let the world's problems divide us forever, and we never form honest and vulnerable connections with other people, it very easily stands to reason that we can't have families. And if I still need to explain to you at this point that this is still extremely relevant to the themes and morals seen in Eiji Aonuma's Legend of Zelda games, you haven't been paying very close attention. So I'm not really going to be any more didactic about that than I already have. Go rewatch those parts of this video if you missed it.
And baby. You guys don't have to repeat the words I say. I know it's a very, very common thing to want to do when you're watching a stream. I've done it myself. It's very easy to do, but I'm just saying, if I say the word baby, you don't have to say baby. It'll be okay.
Now, it's true also that celebrities being responsible for their audience in the same way that parents are responsible for their children is a pretty cliched way to drum up controversy here. That might seem like that's all that's going on. In this particular case, though, you can literally watch Vinny repress these emotions live in real time. Like, he'll pretend to not understand the story, even though he explained it himself maybe 10 minutes earlier out loud.
I still don't understand why the child is, like, dead alive. Which, it's fine. I don't need to know. I'm just saying. It's fine. Whatever.
Okay, kiddo. Let's go.
Is it alive? But the stuff that was being presented to me, I was just like, okay, Kojima's being weird for the sake of being weird. Got it.
You can't. Because you're dead.
Oh. Search for Lou. Oh wait, is baby... But baby is dead. Oh, maybe he's just not okay. To be fair, I don't think I would be either, so that's okay. I'll give him a pass. Oh, maybe he's just not okay.
Okay, kiddo. Let's go.
Is it alive? Oh, maybe he's just not okay. The low frame rate is cool. It's just fucking hilarious.
Sam, that pod is empty. Oh. You know, no one should have to suffer such loss.
Oh wait, is baby... But baby is dead. Oh, maybe he's just not okay. I still don't understand why the child is, like, dead alive. Oh, maybe he's just not okay.
Then you notice something interesting. When Vinny's not trying to convince everyone that he doesn't understand the story, he's busy talking about his legacy and whether or not people take him seriously. This is rather pertinent when you consider the story of Death Stranding 2. No, not the plot, the story. It's about the existential aspects of being a father, bringing another life into the world.
You should explain all your classic bits, from play DMC2 to why no shoot the club cousin. Surely my life has been fulfilling.
Oh boy, that must hurt.
A little bit, man. Vinny would make a terrible post-apocalyptic father. Well, I mean, you could just get rid of post-apocalyptic from that sentence. I'm kind of in a weird position in my life where most of my life is very, very, very normal. And then I go to a convention and it's just bonkers. But people were, you know, talking to me about, like, really, really obscure moments. Like, Vinny, in the corruption stockpile, where you made the character do this, and then Donkey Kong did this, and then Mario did this. How'd you do that? And what was going through your mind when you saw that? Usually, I just don't remember. And though, like, people now ask about the music a little bit more too, and they're like, Vinny, what was the recording like of this thing? And I'm like, I don't remember. Sometimes I do a little bit. Sometimes I don't.
You could say, from a certain point of view, the closest thing Vinny has to children of his own is chat, his audience. For emphasis, I want to argue this has nothing to do with how Vinny is perceiving the quality of Death Stranding 2. Instead, Vinny is using criticism to shield himself emotionally. Which again is probably difficult to understand without context. You wouldn't be able to play armchair psychologist without watching an unhealthy amount of Vinesauce. So it takes one to know one.
And that took a long time to figure out that many times the biggest obstacle is you.
Yeah.
And the limitations you're setting on yourself, you're setting them your own, and you're convinced that the rest of the world has frameworked you this way.
You are literally a professional gamer. By whose metric? Chad admitted one time I was a pro gamer. They said it. They're like, well, you do play video games for a living, right? So you're a pro gamer. I'm like, thank you, Chad. That's very nice of you. I can't believe he's still thinking about that moment. Yeah, that's the only way I can get to sleep at night, is if I remember the moment that the chat member called me a pro gamer.
People that rise in careers in industries, but that came from very, very, very humble beginnings, they tend to have sort of like a lot of scar tissue, because they've fought against the world to get where they were, or at least to get above the tipping point. Because no one believed in them, and no one, there's so many people that no one believed in, so they had to believe in themselves, and then they developed much more defensive attitudes.
I've explained this story a bunch, but yeah, I didn't expect streaming to become anything. There was no money in streaming. Streaming was nothing. It was just like a hobby. All of that stuff seemed unattainable, and I didn't have the drive. So what I wanted to do was just find a job to make money, and then drink on the weekends, as all would do that did such things at the time. And I get it. I mean, that's what life was for a while for me, and it didn't incorporate my degree in any meaningful way, so I just kept doing whatever I could find for a while just to save money and to pay bills. I applied at the public access TV station, and I heard back months later, and I got it. So, just apply to everything, and just get addicted to applying to shit. Picture yourself in a field, in a cellophane moat, plasticine porters. Oh, there's a lever there. But yeah, I mean, just apply to everything. And then I will say from public access, I learned how to edit. I learned how to, film. I got the bug to make videos, and then that turned into YouTube. And then me dropping pudding on a piece of paper. And nothing in between, and here I am now.
People that rise in careers in industries, but that came from very, very, very humble beginnings, they tend to have sort of like a lot of scar tissue. Because they've fought against the world to get where they were, or at least to get above the tipping point. Because no one believed in them, and no one, there's so many people that no one believed in, so they had to believe in themselves, and then they developed much more defensive attitudes. And this was a handicap of mine earlier, is that although I was going for the world, I had no idea how sort of defensive and protective my attitudes were around my ideas or my craft. And that took a long time to figure out that many times the biggest obstacle is you.
Yeah.
And the limitations you're setting on yourself, you're setting them your own, and you're convinced that the rest of the world has frameworked you this way.
All right, let's see if I got any bingo. I'm gonna need your help on this one, chat, so please squeeze it made this. Viney Sauce Vinny bingo. Prematurely rage quits game. Doesn't happen too often. Calls out someone in chat. This is like every potential spectrum of what I could say as a person. So let me call out you. So you can get I2. Let's get I2 going. And I'll say, let me hear about your stuff. What things do you say often? This didn't happen. The appropriate text and conversation probably didn't happen. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. Not much happened. So no bingo here. Vinny, not much happened. You were the best part of the stream. That's a shame. Or are you like R9K mode all the time? I wonder. Oh, I won. Sorry. Oh yeah. Fuck. Cool. Bab.
Star Trek was good, but it wasn't Blade Runner. Feel free to play bingo, but I do say a lot of the same shit over and over again. I do, but I stream for like, 25, 30 hours a week. You know what I mean? Like, and I tend to talk about the things I like. I'm a program. I have my programming. It's a weird thing to see, but I think it's I think it would be natural for most people. I don't know.
It should be a little obvious that these things matter. Life, happiness, love. These are the things that truly matter. And for some reason, gamers like Vinny think that it's strange for an artist to care about these things more than the entertainment quality of a game. When gamers fail to recognize story, it's not actually because they're too stupid to understand it. It's all too easy to accuse them of being stupid. But I know Vinny. I know he's not stupid. And as we saw before, Matthew Matosis wasn't as stupid as he let on either. Humans tell each other stories as invaluable life lessons, and they're always framed in a way where you can understand them and interpret them for how the story may apply to your own life.
It's like when I play this game and this happens, I know that again, I'm playing it wrong because I'm not like, I'm making fun of it a little bit. But listen, it is cool. I mean, I'm glad Kojima can do stuff like this. I think Kojima needs someone to hold him back. If Kojima was able to do everything he wanted all the time, the MGS series would not be nearly as liked. I've heard that opinion a lot, and I like Kojima a lot. I really do, and I love his games, most of them. And there are some earlier games of his I would like to check out. But I actually think that is an interesting, and I agree with that sentiment about limitation helps, and people saying no or being honest and giving you a little bit of pushback can lead to a better product. I mean, I'm glad Kojima can do stuff like this. Like, I'm happy for him. I think Kojima needs someone to hold him back, and I agree with that sentiment. I'm glad Kojima can do stuff like this. I think Kojima needs someone to hold him back. Like, I'm happy for him. I think Kojima needs someone to hold him back, and I agree with that sentiment. Like, I've seen people, like, really, like kind of, they become his, like, personal bodyguards. I think he can handle himself. I think he's a big boy, Kojima. I think Kojima needs someone to hold him back. I think he can handle himself. I think Kojima needs someone to hold him back.
You kept it all this time. Perhaps you still have a chance to stop this nightmare. You brought the world together. You have the right to decide. Pull the rope or cut the noose. But whatever you do, don't hesitate. I'm ready, Sandstrand. Make your choice.
Wait. I don't know what to do.
Sure you do. After everything, how could you not?
Gamers are capable of doing this. Again, we are not stupid people, but they just don't want to admit it to themselves. They don't want to confront their emotions through fiction, which speaks volumes for how incapable they must be of confronting them in general or practical contexts. Because fiction is supposed to be a safe space. It's not like Death Stranding is literally about Vinny and chat. It's just about a man and his son. Vinny was able to follow this. He's not stupid. He just continually and audibly repressed and suppressed that information. Vinny's unique in this scenario, not in the fact that these things make him uncomfortable, but instead he's unique because we can actually see him create these problems for himself live in real time. Matthew Matosis wasn't that stupid, we saw that, but he had enough time to script out a video quote-unquote critiquing the game, which in reality was just mental gymnastics to ignore the fact that he couldn't face the music and look inside of himself. This is what all fiction is about. Books, movies, games. Games doing this isn't strange, or at the very least it shouldn't be strange if we want to live in a world where artists are allowed to create art. This is why all humans across time have told each other stories.
It's time for you to hit the road and start a new journey.
Wow, episode 2 is short.
Super convenient. Gotta get that hay bale. That's the whole. What that? Good chapter.
And as long as gamers remain dependent on toys that help keep them emotionally incapable, and as long as they throw tantrums every time a game asks them to be an adult, we're just not gonna get anywhere. The first step to fixing a problem is accepting that you have one in the first place. And I really don't know if Vinny will actually metabolize this as his own failing, and not the game's. In the end, not only is the Zelda timeline not a fan theory, not retroactive, and not only is the story not inconsequential, isolated, or foreign, it is genuinely everything. And that's the only proper way to understand the real world, is by accepting that when someone has an idea they're putting forth, you're either there to accept it or reject it entirely. By only metabolizing a fraction of what's being put in front of you, what gamers have to realize, if they're actually going to make an impact beyond their own pleasure, is that it's actually worse to only metabolize a fraction of it than if you would have never engaged with it whatsoever.
It was really artists that unlocked my mind, when I started arriving in New York and getting around serious heavyweight intellectuals. They'd be like, well, that's really interesting, but where's the beef? What's behind this? What's your purpose? Why? Are you just masturbating and putting something up there because it's fun and you go, look what I could do, look at my talent? Or do you see problems with the world that you might use art to address in some way?
The Legend of Zelda games that Eiji Aonuma directed aren't the pinnacle of game design. The only reason that we haven't done better than that is because we refuse to hold ourselves accountable to the standards that they put in place, and not because they're great games, even though they absolutely are. This is temporary, but because this whole section is a digital construction site right now, I thought it would be kind to show everyone my blueprints. Obviously, whether you think I'm legit or you think I'm pulling this out of my ass, I do have to string the development of 5 games into one coherent story, which Aonuma already did because he's a genius, but if I can be a fourth as cohesive covering this material as he was when he created it, I'll die happily. One of the things I plan to use to tie things together is the reoccurring theme of puppets. I'm of the position that Aonuma wasn't trying to overtly insert puppets motif into his stories until after Ueda pointed it out to him, but it does culminate in that moment in Twilight Princess that I talk about at the beginning of Section 2. There's a lot leading up to it. So first we're just going to discuss Ueda's perspective. This is all the material that goes into the Ico part of Section 3. Which means, yes, it's finally time to look at the history of the Ico games in depth and detail. And Ico and Shadow of the Colossus will have their own little portions in between Majora and Wind Waker, and in between Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, since that's when they released, and that's when they would have played each other's games. I'm going to argue that Aonuma didn't learn of Ico until partway through creating Wind Waker, but semantics aside, this graphic should demonstrate the structure of Section 3, which, by the way, I've kept straight in my head since April 15th, 2025, and if you don't believe me, you can watch all my work in progress stuff. I keep them unlisted in a public playlist, so it's not really hidden from anyone, because transparency is something I value very deeply. At any rate, it was likely of subconscious influence since, Aonuma did make puppets that whole time, and I think maybe there's moral ambiguity towards the middle part of Ico, that you feel maybe you're the one manipulating Yorda, dragging her around everywhere. Yuita probably really loved the castle escape sequence with Zelda following you around and helping you open doors, because that's pretty much the genesis of that Lego game kind of thing, or like Mystery Mayhem, the way that you switch between two characters that have different abilities and can go through different passages and solve puzzles by switching between them. I'm not sure if there's a word for that exactly, but regardless, it's huge to Yuita because of how he made Last Guardian, essentially the same thing. And if I'm missing anything, as always, please let me know. I am curious to learn from other people. I'm not an elitist. I have tolerance, and I also have standards, like everybody else. I'm not trying to be a dick, but yes, I had to gatekeep a little more than usual recently because of a bunch of outbursts. So anyway, here are the puppet notes. Aonuma was arguably hired at Nintendo because of the wooden puppets he made. In Ocarina of Time, Zelda feels that she's manipulated Link and dragged him into a situation he didn't ask for. In Majora's Mask, the Icona Doctor is manipulated by his passion for archaeology, and Skull Kid is puppeteered by the mask, among many other situations where characters are being controlled by other characters. In Ico, the Queen uses Yorda as her puppet. This is where I'm currently stuck chronologically, but this does not mean that I can't work out of order. So it's important to me to build the entirety of the structure of Section 3, rather than just filling out all the details and going, one by one. I'm going to be jumping around a little bit. In Wind Waker, Zelda apologizes again for roping Link into her affairs. Also in Wind Waker, Mila tries to rationalize her thievery by saying that poverty forced her hand, but Link makes her realize that she has free will and she can choose to do good. Also in Wind Waker, Ganondorf doesn't turn into Ganon. Instead, he uses Ganon puppets. This gets into how Ganondorf himself feels that he is a puppet and that he wasn't in control of what he did in Oot to a certain degree. In Shadow of the Colossus, Wander allows himself to be Dorman's puppet out of his own selfish desire to bring back the dead. In Twilight Princess, Midna is manipulated by Zelda, and Zant is manipulated by Ganondorf, and Zelda becomes Ganon's puppet. All of this is recontextualization of everything that happened in Majora, because it means that transformations of all kind are like this, that you can't control it, and that it controls you instead. And that goes back to, Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf. He couldn't really control the fact that he turned into a pig demon thing. And then in Skyward Sword, the proposal is made that Destiny itself could be considered manipulation because it preys on external factors, and that Zelda is responsible for something that Hylia did. This also goes back to the idea of, guilt and blame. And so far, those are my notes. So again, let me know if I missed any. The rest of this video was going to be a small biography of Eiji Aonuma and an explanation of which story elements were important to him personally and why. I ran into a couple complications. On one hand, there's still 2 or 3 prerequisites that we need to cover in order to have the full context, both for historical accuracy and also for the specific points that I just want to make. On the other hand, I kind of have to end the video at some point. And no, it wasn't originally meant to be 5 hours long. So I've decided to compromise on a couple things here. First, I need to say up front that Takashi Tezuka is the reason that Zelda has the identity it does today, of this high fantasy, Tolkien-esque kind of story. Tezuka slowly introduced these elements into Mario, as evidenced by the whole Mushroom Kingdom Princess Peach stuff. And he's largely responsible for really just the entirety of what people generally consider to be iconic about Mario and Zelda. He's an extraordinary director and level designer, and his exclusion in this is something I may deeply regret for a long time because of how deep of a compromise it really is. But as it stands, his work is outside the scope of this video, as this video is about Aonuma and Aonuma's stories. Now, Aonuma's stories take after Yoshiaki Koizumi, and Koizumi himself is taking after Tezuka, but I ended up deciding that this was a layer of removal too far, and by the time of Ocarina, Tezuka is largely out of the picture. My hope is that eventually someone else who is far more familiar with the level design of Mario 3 and Mario World will come along and make an excellent video out of all these shmupulations.com interviews that I found. But as it stands, I'm working on this video, entirely alone. I have a life to get back to. The other compromise, which I don't feel nearly as bad about, by the way, is the portion of covering Ocarina of Time is significantly shorter than any of the other games. Ocarina of Time is, of course, a brilliant game, but it's a game which has already been covered in detail by countless others, and I see no reason to really be redundant about that. But, of course, we can't just immediately start my abridged version of Ocarina of Time's development history now, can we? Because the office politics at Nintendo and the history of the whole company do actually pertain to the story purposes of each Zelda game and how Aonuma wanted you to interpret them. So I decided I'd cover that too in sort of a Cliff Notes kind of way. The story of the 3D Zelda games are about Aonuma's life, and working at Nintendo had a large impact on his life. In a lot of cases, the struggle of certain characters is actually just Aonuma projecting his own struggles from his career. These earlier Nintendo games are going to be a footnote in this video, because obviously our subject is only tangentially involved with it. That doesn't mean that all of these games are not interesting in their own right. I did a little bit more research for this section that ended up being necessary, because what I realized is that I am going to separately make the argument that a lot of them are not interesting in their own right. To make a long story short, the real, actual argument is whether or not the video games are art now, because it's very trivial to prove that in the past, video games were not trying to be art by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm not going to entertain any more pearl clutching from the fans in this section, because I already did that for an hour and a half. I'm not sorry for anything I say in this section. Every medium has gone through a period where they were accessible only to the rich and patented by companies to squeeze as much cash out of the customer as possible. As we're going to see, this is what retro games are actually indicative of. I'm still going to discuss Miyamoto and Tezuka as artists, because they are artists, but it's important to distinguish the difference between something that contains art and something that is art in and of itself. This is why when Eiji Aonuma came to the Zelda team and made radical changes that he did, those changes were simply what was necessary in order for Zelda to become a meaningful work of art. Only around SNES did video games take their very first steps into being something deeply personal, to one person at the heart of its development. Games are a very new thing, and I think accepting that and trying to show how we've changed is the path forward for making all of this more commonly accepted. My sources will all be on screen as I'm talking. Actually, a lot of this is pretty easy to find. I think the reason you don't really hear most of this, though, is because Nintendo fans haven't really scratched the surface of it. But really, most of this is a simple trace into the Wayback Machine from Wikipedia, Shmupulations, IGN, Nintendo Dream, and Famitsu. None of this is hidden information, it's all still very Googleable. The only really obscure book I found during this was Boss Fight Books number 26 by Gabe Dunham. But even this book uses almost the exact same sources I'm using here. Out of all these, my primary source will be this ebook by Ishan Sadiv, which itself is a compilation of all his thankless work on the Zelda fandom wiki. Now, any other day of the week, if you told me that your source for something came from a fandom wiki, I would laugh in your face. But as I did research on this project, trying to find certain key things like Aonuma's puppets, for example, I kept bumping into this Zelda wiki, which I was thoroughly surprised by, because most fandom wikis treat any development history as if it's trivia, and they only care about documenting in-universe crap. But apparently my intuition was wrong. The Zelda fandom wiki is one of few that contains information in it. You might be curious as to why I'm not using Hyrule Historia as my primary source, or some other official source. The short answer is that Nintendo as a company has incentive to lie. But Nintendo is very rich and very smart. Nintendo knows that we know that they have incentive to lie. So what they do instead of lying is to just not tell us anything at all. But I'll be saving that for a little later after we have some more context. Actually, on the subject of history being lost over time and obfuscated for political gain, the Zelda games themselves, through parody and otherwise, are constantly dealing with their history and their culture being destroyed or hidden from most of Hyrule's denizens. In Wind Waker, of course, Ganon destroys the world and the flood happens, but in Twilight Princess, because the Hylians suffered no tragedy, their history still languishes due to apathy and complacency. And it's a theme running through all the games, since there's 100-year time jumps between each entry, and the main characters are removed from a certain context, creating situational irony. Lots of those things that I talked about in Section 1, they are hidden from the characters, but they are not hidden from the player. So I think that makes an experience like this pretty rewarding in kind of a direct way, even if you aren't a Zelda nerd, like I am. As we go through these different games, you're going to notice a trend where the game the artist discusses in the interview is a different game entirely from the one that's playable on a cartridge today. Director of the 3D Mario series, Yoshiaki Koizumi, recalls, "My first assignment when I was hired at Nintendo was to do the art and layout and eventually writing for the manual for A Link to the Past. What was funny was at that time, it didn't seem like they'd really figured out what most of the game's elements meant, so it was up to me to come up with a story and things while I was working on the manual. Back then, the people who wrote manuals often became the people who came up with most of the backstory for the entire game. The first real game work that I did was on Link's Awakening, but at the same time, I came in to write the manual, as I did in the previous game. But they had nothing in place. So I ended up making an entire story to go along with the game. The dream, the island, that was all mine. The scenarios 80s era game devs were trying to simulate only represent a fraction of their concept, which is why at the time, most story information is given to you through the game's manual, or posted on the side of the cabinet, which you're supposed to read first, and then try to match the graphics on screen to the characters described in the text. You can successfully do this, but the effect leaves a lot to be desired.
そもそも私がゼルダと初めて出会ったのは1988年任天堂に入社して間もなくのことでした。大学時代にデザインを学んだ私はその後ピクセルでさまざまなキャラクターをデザインする仕事を始めますが、その頃の私はゲームを遊んだ経験があまりなく、特に反射神経を必要とするゲームは苦手でした。ゲームを始めてすぐフィールドに出現するオクタロックの動きが読めずにいきなりゲームオーバーとなり、その後多少操作に慣れてきてもスクロールを繰り返すたびに新たに出現するオクタロックと出会い、私はこいつと永遠に戦い続けなければいけないのかと途中でゲームを進めることを断念してしまいました。結果、私にとってゼルダの伝説は自分には向いていないジャンルのゲームだという印象を持ったのです。
Just as Aonuma says, Famicom games like the first Legend of Zelda are frustrating, not just for the player, but for the designers too. Earlier in the same interview, Mr. Koizumi admits, "I didn't get really far at all in Super Mario Bros. Because I wasn't really good at action games. The first time I played a Famicom was in college, and I'd had no prior gaming experience whatsoever. Even though Famicom came out when I was in the 6th grade, it was when I was in college that I borrowed one from a friend to play Super Mario Bros. I realized on World 1-1 that I wasn't really good at it at all. I kept dying, and it was at that point that it occurred to me, what do first-time players think of games like this? You jump right in, and you just die over and over again. I found it a little easier to play Zelda because Link has 3 hearts. It's not like you touch something once and you're dead." Mr. Koizumi goes on to say, "I was studying film, drama, and animation. I did some storyboarding as well. My original career ambition was that I wanted to be a film director. My first opportunity to play a Nintendo system was in college, but my ambition had always been to make drama. That was my goal. Having a character in a certain kind of world, having him go through a series of actions to accomplish something, and creating a dramatic tension throughout that. And games seemed like a really good opportunity to create that kind of drama that you don't find in films." So for Aonuma, the more obvious choice was what he calls text adventures.
では逆に自分に向いているゲームとは何かというと、テキストアドベンチャーというジャンルのゲームです。 物語を読むのが好きだった私にとって、その物語にインタラクティブに参加できるこの手のゲームは、自分の考えによって物語が進行していくという手応えに面白さを感じ、しかも反射神経のような技術を要求しない、うまい下手が問われない種類のゲームなので、自分が作るとしたらそういうゲームを作りたいと思うようになっていました。
Aonuma and his contemporaries were very much fascinated by these text adventures. For all my fellow Zoomers out there, you might recognize this as the escape room genre, but it didn't originate with Flash and Newgrounds. Instead, it originated here on early computers like the Commodore, and was also later refined on CD-ROM games like Myst, Riven, or even Nancy Drew. Both Koizumi and Aonuma would take a lot of inspiration from the really early games in that genre. In case I didn't make myself clear enough before, the people who end up pushing the frontiers in technology, in the beginning they were simply industrious storytellers who wanted to have their story told by whatever means necessary. They're trying to get their point across, and the story is the ultimate point. The scenarios that 90s and 2000s era game devs were trying to simulate are not only more clearly depicted, but they're more specific ideas in general. It's not just broad themes, it's specific subject material and specific philosophy. When you go back now to play Mario 64 or Marvelous and Other Treasure Island, their point-and-click adventure game influences are unmistakable. Big Boo's Haunt is almost room-for-room quoting Denzini Land, even down to extremely specific objective where you find their red keycard underneath a coffin. Finding Kozu's diary in the crawlspaces of Yamakama Mansion is almost exactly the same as the sequence you need to do to escape the prison in Forsaken Fortress, which reveals a lot about Ganon's character motivations in The Wind Waker. But, of course, I'm getting ahead of myself. As much as I'd like to make this first part 100% about point-and-click games on the Commodore, you and I know full well that, historically, those weren't the most lucrative games at the time. Instead, people from 1980 to 1990 were much more familiar with arcade cabinets. Our story begins in 1977. A young artist and toy designer named Shigeru Miyamoto joined Japanese toy maker Nintendo. Having impressed company president Hiroshi Yamauchi with his work, Miyamoto was assigned to create artwork for an arcade game named Sheriff, wherein the player found themselves surrounded by bandits and needed to fend them off, in the process, saving a young woman they captured. Sheriff was Nintendo's first damsel in distress game, a concept Miyamoto would subsequently reuse across many of his later games. For a little extra clarification, the damsel in distress is certainly a character role that many Nintendo games revisit, but I wouldn't be so quick to say that any game where you're saving a woman from danger is explicitly inspired or influenced by Miyamoto. It's a concept that many different people can come to independently. But even if you ignore the wider detail and you're only focusing on Nintendo games, this archetype is still very distinct. At this point, they're not princesses yet. Princess Peach, Princess Zelda. Miyamoto himself specifically refers to Pauline as Mario's girlfriend. The idea that these were princesses would come later.
どうして一生懸命上へ行くのかっていうと、やっぱりそこには愛しい彼女がいるからやとかですね。で、敵はどうするっていうと、そんな凶暴なやつは嫌だと。だからちょっとライバルに近いやつを置こうと。ただ女の子をこう連れて逃げながら小脇に抱えていくぐらいって言ったらゴリラがいいなとか、そういう展開ですよね。
But this part of the book is overlooking much more than just this. Around the exact same time, Miyamoto was also working on a cabinet based on Fleischer's Popeye cartoons. That game eventually released, but it was after Donkey Kong already came out. We know that game was actually delayed, and we know that delay was because Nintendo struggled with the Popeye license. Now, this is very bizarre. Usually, when you're creating a licensed video game, you're doing so because you already had a license, and you're trying to make the game to justify buying the license. The idea that Nintendo would begin development of a Popeye game without the Popeye license tells you pretty clearly that this was not Nintendo's idea, it was the developer's idea. Miyamoto. This is very easy to piece together, but it turns out you don't even have to, because he just admits it in an interview. The basic concept of Popeye is that there is a hero and his rival who he manages to turn the tables on with the aid of spinach. I sketched out a few ideas for games using Popeye. At that point, Yokio-san said it was good enough to bring these ideas to the president's attention, and in the end, one of the ideas received official approval. Yokoi-san thought that designers would become necessary members of development teams in order to make games in the future, and that's how Donkey Kong came about. Iwata asked him, but originally it was going to be a Popeye game. That's right. But while I can't exactly recall why it was, we were unable to use Popeye in that title. It felt like the ladder had really been pulled out from under us, so to speak, which is a joke about how the Popeye game is about climbing ladders. Now, my first reaction to this information was to say that Miyamoto's concept of Mario drew from Popeye, and the class's struggles were a key thing going on under the surface. It would have explained why Mario is a plumber, a lion tamer, he later becomes a doctor, and it would have made sense with Miyamoto's other interests, because when he came up with Zelda, one of the main things he drew from was The Great Gatsby, which is also about classism in America. The problem with analyzing Shigeru Miyamoto in this way, though, is that he himself admits that the character of Mario was invented as a mascot first, not a character with a story.
But, you know, when you look at a guy like Mario, he's a pretty unlikely hero, isn't he? He's a, pudgy Italian plumber with more facial hair than Donkey Kong has. Tell us about how you came up with him.
だからやっぱりもともとねこんなちっちゃい絵なんですよね。マリオを描くときっていうのは。
We had to draw Mario as a small character, and at the same time, we had to make him look human.
じゃあどんな顔がいいかっていうと、これはビデオゲームでこういうちっちゃい箱の中に描くわけですからね。ちっちゃい絵で描いてもどんな顔してるのかよく分かるやつがいいっていうので。少しデフォルメできるやつ。デフォルメするためにはやっぱ鼻を大きくひげをつけて、で帽子を着せて。しかもこう髪の毛なんかがふさふさ動く絵はとてもちっちゃい絵で描けないんで、帽子をかぶらしてごまかせとかですね。
To do that, we needed to draw a distinctive feature for him, such as giving him a big nose. We gave him a mustache so that we didn't need to draw a mouth. It's difficult to show facial expressions with small characters. We gave him big hands. Since we were trying to create something distinctive in the character, it was natural to draw something like that.
でその中ではやっぱり一番マルチに対応できるって、スポーツをしても OK ですし、コメディをやっても OK という意味ではいいタレントさんという感じですね。そうですね、意味もなくも出てもらおうというぐらいですから、最初パンチアウトの観客席にマリオとかドンキーコングを描いたりですね、テニスの審判のところにマリオを、これみんな喜ぶんですね。あ、マリオがいるって。でそういうことをいろいろチャレンジしてたじゃない、自然にやってましたね。面白がってやってましたね。
First, we created Mario with dots, putting together these distinctive features. Then I finalized with a drawing to show a final image of the character. So I didn't have any special theory behind the making of Mario. He evolved over the development process, followed by a final drawing of what I wanted him to look like.
Now, believe it or not, Miyamoto was not the first artist to model a new character after an older one. Actually, he wasn't even the first video game developer to do this, but Donkey Kong's success and Nintendo's subsequent refocus as a video game company artificially bolstered this niche. In the early to mid-90s, you had games like Battletoads to Metroid aping the styles of TMNT and Alien, respectively. The depiction of characters is exactly why Miyamoto focused so much on colorful characters at a side profile angle with dark backgrounds. It was all about emphasizing their silhouette. When a Paramount executive came into the office to see it, they'd be able to recognize the portrayal of their mascot, Popeye. This remained true. Mario was conceptually rooted in being a mascot for the sake of being a mascot, for the sake of this new era of Nintendo needing a mascot. This inherent business decision also had the unintended side effect of making games more focused on hand-eye coordination. You can read the anatomy of the character, their actions are telegraphed to you, and you can adjust your reaction time. I hope I don't need to say this, but challenge centered around reaction time wasn't invented in the arcade era. All video games, as well as pinball, initially spawned from casino gambling machines, self-proclaimed games of skill. And if you go back further than that, there's carnival games where you also win prizes by playing games with unreasonable precision, but like I said, I don't want to be too didactic. It's kind of a shame because I already knew later on I'd be talking shit on Miyamoto, and starting out here, I really wanted to give him a fair chance, but he doesn't do himself any favors. Something I think that people overlook about Miyamoto is that, essentially, he's a reverse weeaboo. He's a Japanese man infatuated with American culture. He likes cowboy vests, he's well known around the office for playing bluegrass music. Here he is pictured with his banjo.
Hello, my name is Cowboy Tanaka.
So, when I say that it's very in character for Miyamoto's first directed game to be an adaptation of Popeye, this is exactly what I'm talking about. He likes rubber hose animation, he likes 1920s styled industrialism with girders and steamboats and trains, and burly working class men with big jaw lines. He really likes cowboys. But again, Miyamoto doesn't really fight for his ability to depict these things. There's really no attempt to organize these scattered ideas into a story himself. And as we're going to see later, Miyamoto also wasn't particularly interested in other developers trying to tell their own stories either. But even if that weren't the case, there's just an inherent misunderstanding here, that to draw, you must have a lot of mechanical knowledge about things. And while perspective and anatomy do help, ultimately drawing is not a skill. It's confidence.
I think the great fight is that the art world, the established art world, it's fundamental to keep an established art world, that the mystery is kept in place, because once it falls into the hands of a proletariat, that the ability to make art is in fact inherent with all of us. It demolishes the idea of art for commerce, and that's no good for business. And so I think that there's always a great coming together of a commerce establishment, which the art world is basically a commerce establishment, to protect its own. I mean, the perfect example is that there were many signers or graffiti artists working in the late 70s and in the early 80s. Why should it be that only 2 or 3 of them, Scharf, Haring, and Basquiat, should be taken from the sea of signers that were working in New York, some of them incredibly talented guys, and then elevated to a point that there was something particularly special about those 3 guys? It behoves the art establishment to elevate them to a higher plateau as fast as possible, to make them unavailable aesthetically to a low art market. And it does that continually. It's very capable of... It behoves
the art community to do
yes,
that.
It extends its parameters quite widely to capture the new thing.
Because that does
and elevate it from low art to high art, successfully enough to increase the commerce proposition that goes along with it.
In order to enhance the value of the painting.
Absolutely.
For all concerned, for the dealer and for everybody.
And to consign the idea of art to a particular world.
Do you agree with that, Julian?
Well, I thought it was very interesting when he was talking about, like, that everybody could be an artist. And I think that's a very healthy attitude. And because I think
it's nice to say on the street, but you try and see it work in practice.
I don't think the business of selling a work of art has anything to do with the value of a work of art.
It shouldn't.
It doesn't.
It shouldn't.
I mean,
the barrier to entry on this stuff is arbitrated by the people at the top. They want to make all the money off of it. They're not going to teach you how to make your own video game. Why would they deliberately create competitors? Regardless of how much Nintendo may try to hide the process from us, it's common sense to figure out that it's still just a computer game. They're created the exact same way that all computer games are made. First of all, with a computer. Nintendo games, by virtue of appealing to family markets and appealing to children, are all very low budget as to make them affordable to the parents. It's well understood that all first-party Nintendo games essentially work off the same architecture. Separate titles really don't represent separate periods of work. The start of one game's development and the end of another are decided arbitrarily and only retroactively. So, in this case, the Popeye game and the Donkey Kong game are both using similar mechanics of climbing ladders, and probably based off the same engine and project file. The real difference between them is just the level design and the character designs, I guess. If you're comparing release notes and development history at this scale, One of the very first things you'll notice is that all of these games are developed on top of each other, and often in the exact same room, on the exact same computer. It's well understood that Ocarina of Time and Mario 64 run on the same physics and rendering engines, even down to sharing assets like this door texture. Ocarina of Time was the first Mario 64 ROM hack, okay? At the earliest stages of development, all of these games share many more assets together as initial placeholders. These lines between not just titles, but entire series that consumers see as so concrete just aren't so. The production of games is merely an extension of the production of consoles. The SNES is just a modded version of the NES. The N64 is basically a mod of the SNES with the Mode 7 chip. I've heard many times, being in GameCube circles, that essentially the Wii is just two GameCubes, quote-unquote, duct-taped together. And, so on and so forth. The games work this way, too. But because the public only sees a new console or a new game when it's well past the concept phase and has already had multiple art passes, the layman is led to believe that you do have to have proprietary software and a team of 100 people to make a video game. Again, just as David Bowie said, this is all deliberate. It's simply in Nintendo's business interest to obfuscate the creation process into marketing and hype. They plan these reveals years in advance, and they're carefully selected and staged for certain financial quarters. Demos and show stages are explicitly not for the sake of testing and development. If you've ever seen a game change drastically after it was revealed, what you've actually seen is a project being cancelled and its assets being repurposed into a new project. On paper, it's just nicer to say, no, of course we didn't kill this project because we didn't think it was going to make us any money. Oh, we just retooled things. It's all very deceptive, and because of non-disclosure agreements, it's the only perspective you generally get. People who are happy to absorb whatever Nintendo feeds them will never have the motivation to question any of this, and as a result, they're just totally clueless on development history. So this is why I'm not using Hyrule Historia as my primary source. Now, it does have a lot of exclusive concept art that we've never seen before, and plenty of citations from Aonuma himself. But crucially, when the book shows these things, the concept art is presented unsigned, undated, and no context for who drew it, or who told them to draw it, or why they told them to draw it. So no, it's not actually insightful in terms of discussing the development history, let alone Aonuma's ultimate intentions for the narrative. A big example I'm going to use here is the concept art for Midna. Midna and Fi actually both went through major design revisions, since the partner character of any Zelda game is extremely important. Though you'll notice for Midna, even though all these designs do look pretty cool in their own right, they're all settled around a similar theme of a small imp girl riding a big, scary beast. This isn't brainstorming. Takazawa was drawing Midna based on instructions given to him by Aonuma. But Nintendo wouldn't want you to know something like this because, again, they want to make it seem like this is a big corporate achievement. Oh, it wasn't Aonuma. No, it was the whole Zelda team. Great job, team. We met our expectations for this quarter. Aonuma himself will use similar language, admittedly inconveniently, but that's really just him being humble. Aonuma is credited as a director, and the job of a director is to lead the team, and the job of the team is to follow the director's instructions. It's that simple. And this is the exact same way computer companies, Namco, Sega, Nintendo, hid arcade cabinets from the public in the 80s and the 90s. They weren't doing this to protect their intellectual property. They were doing it to crush competition by making this technology inaccessible to even attempt making a game in the first place. Think about it. Do you even know what vendors you would go to manufacture motherboards for a cartridge? Of course you don't. That information is deliberately hidden from you. Koizumi worked very closely with Tezuka during Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. Because this is such a great interview, you should be made aware it's from Wired Magazine's Game Life in 2007. The interviewer, Chris Kohler, begins the piece by saying, "Ever been touched by a storyline element in a Mario or a Zelda game? You can thank Yoshiaki Koizumi, director of Super Mario Galaxy, and a 16-year veteran of Nintendo's top development teams. Educated as a filmmaker, Koizumi wanted to get deeper stories in the Nintendo games, even if Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto didn't. I would sort of try to find sneaky ways to get story elements in without them noticing too much, Koizumi said of his early work. These are aspects of games that Miyamoto wasn't nearly as fond of and occasionally didn't like. Having spent the better part of the last 5 years learning about Miyamoto and the development of the stories in video games, I found my recent conversation with Koizumi to be absolutely fascinating. Apparently, he felt the same way. That was really interesting. Make sure you print all of this, he said as I left the room. Done, sir. Below, you will find lengthy results of our hour-long conversation touching on stories, Super Mario Galaxy's gameplay, and how it relates back to Mario Sunshine. How Koizumi often finds filling... Below, you'll find the lengthy results of our hour-long conversation touching on stories, Super Mario Galaxy's gameplay design, and how it relates back to Mario Sunshine. How Koizumi often finds himself filling Miyamoto's shoes, and how he is sometimes the only one who can understand the legendary game designer's cryptic comments. So you're coming into Nintendo wanting to make dramatic stories in video games, and they tell you, okay, make a manual. Did you tell them, no, I have no experience laying out art for a manual, this isn't what I want to do? Or did it make a lot of sense to you that that would be the way that you started? I was just really having a good time with all the work they were giving me. I had plenty of experience drawing and writing in college, and so I was perfectly comfortable doing this. But every time someone told me work on this manual, and that involved drawing and writing, it usually ended up linking to some other tasks where they'd say, it's also okay if you don't mind working on this? So I was very much stimulated by all these possibilities. So after Link's Awakening, was your work mostly concentrated on writing for the games themselves? Also, in a broader sense, Nintendo games don't usually pursue big dramatic stories. How would you compare that to the way other cinematic video games are done? What style is better for getting the story across? You're right, EAD doesn't tend to focus on the big story in most of their games, but I was the one coming up with scenarios just on my own ever since the time of Link's Awakening. But even at that time, I felt like I came up with this entire scenario and backstory for Link, but nobody seemed to care. They were always saying, let's try not to push the story forward too much. So I would try to find sneaky ways to get it in without them noticing too much. For example, I always liked the idea of you coming upon another character and hearing little bits of conversation that slowly start to reveal different parts of the story. And that was the way that I tried to work on Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. A lot of EAD games that do seem to have a lot of story, a lot of that came from my influence. But those are aspects of games that Miyamoto wasn't nearly as fond of and occasionally didn't like. I always thought it was interesting that Miyamoto started off with Donkey Kong, pushing this idea of story in video games, makes this revolutionary game in which you have, for the first time, this narrative, this main character on a quest. And then immediately after Donkey Kong, he immediately pulls back from that, doesn't want to do it anymore, and just wants to concentrate on gameplay. And that seems to have set the tone for much of EAD's content for the last 3 decades. When you think about the whole Save the Princess storyline of games being one of Miyamoto's inventions, I don't think of that as a story so much as it is a goal. It's a way of creating a situation. There's not necessarily a build-up and a resolution of a deeper kind, like you'd find in a novel. It's just a situation that motivates the players lacking that kind of detailed nuance. That doesn't mean I'm not interested in the story at all. It just means that as a designer, my priorities are a little different. I tend to convey emotion in a slightly different ways, rather than just rely on the most obvious kind of narrative that we would think of when we think of storylines. So Miyamoto gives you the goal, and that's what you needed in Donkey Kong to play through and accomplish it with the right sense of motivation. And it's true that Miyamoto may think of other things outside of that as perhaps extraneous, but that doesn't mean that it's the wrong way to make games. It's just 2 very different styles. Notice that Koizumi's perspective on Donkey Kong's design is extremely consistent with Miyamoto's. Miyamoto almost uses these exact same words when talking about it in the interview I showed earlier. Obviously, though, when Koizumi talks about it, the connotation's completely different. Koizumi and Aonuma had this adversarial relationship with Miyamoto, and this is hugely important to understanding 3D Zelda. It's the starting point for all of this. I find this particular interview question very telling. At E3 1998, Takashi Tezuka was asked, "What is it like to work with Miyamoto?" Tezuka says, "He's just a normal person. He's not bossy or hard on anyone. He's like working with a friend." And even though it's Tezuka's question, Miyamoto chimes in at the end, which in and of itself should give you bad vibes. But he says, "That's the kind of atmosphere I try to create, but some of the new guys think I'm terrible." Again, this interview was conducted at E3 1998, when they were revealing Ocarina of Time, which is also the same time when both Koizumi and Aonuma were both new to the Zelda team. In retrospect, there's a non-zero chance that Miyamoto was referring directly to them as the new guys when he says this. Clearly, I had to skip around a bit because there's certain things that we only learned in retrospect that are relevant to the time period and the truth about the company culture. But I think we're finally ready to tackle A Link to the Past. A Link to the Past is essential to discussing Ocarina of Time, because in effect, Ocarina began development as a prequel to this game. The genesis of Ganondorf, this legend about a sacred power slumbering underneath the land, and whoever touches it determining the fate of the world, is an essential story in Shinto mythology, and the Namazu, the earthquake fish. This is the Japanese origin myth for earthquakes, that there's this giant fish underneath the earth, and when it shakes, it creates earthquakes. And Taka Mikazuki, the god of war and thunder, is tasked with keeping it at bay. This part of the story would go on to be repurposed in Spirit Tracks, where the Namazu is Malladus, and it's being held under the earth by the railroads, the Spirit Tracks, which were put in place by the Locomos. And coincidentally enough, the same myth is the inspiration for Mother 3's story, where the dragon is kept at bay by the Magypsies, and instead of Spirit Tracks, it's Needles. Mother 3 will be important soon, so I'm just touching on it briefly. But you'll notice this is consistent. Whoever awakens the dragon or the fish is responsible for how the world is remade during the reconstruction period after the earthquake being a symbol for the world being destroyed and then reborn, which is exactly what we see in A Link to the Past. The dark world is filled with these sinkholes, chasms, and bottomless ravines, just like the aftermath of a level 5 earthquake. In fact, earthquakes being a symbol or a metaphor for the destruction of the world go back even further than this. It's almost omnipresent in fiction. It makes sense from a pure mechanical standpoint that the Dark World would have more kill boxes in order to make it more difficult, as it's this late game area. And it would also make sense that Koizumi would read into that and interpret these things as the aftermath of an earthquake. So the question was, what or who caused the destruction of the world? This is how Koizumi created Ganondorf, and this was simply the story that needed to be told next. Mr. Koizumi was given a lot more freedom, though, when he started Link's Awakening. To help achieve this, Tezuka laid out a list of requirements for Koizumi and Kensu Tanabe to follow. The game would have no Princess Zelda, no Triforce, and would not take place in Hyrule, and be set in a relatively small playing field. Tezuka would recall, at the time, Twin Peaks was rather popular. The drama was about a small number of characters in a small town. So when it came to The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, I wanted to make something that, while it would be small enough in scope to easily understand, it would also have deep and distinctive characteristics. Shigeru Miyamoto had mentored his developers to prioritize fun and intuitiveness above all else, which is why Mario and Zelda games were light on storytelling. However, Miyamoto was focused on other projects at the time, leaving the team free to do as it pleased. Koizumi, who viewed video games as a medium that was well suited to telling engaging stories, saw the opportunity to give the new Zelda a sense of drama. Without Miyamoto's oversight, Kazuki Morita, Koizumi, Tanabe, and Tezuka began to turn their Zelda into a character-driven adventure, filled with engaging side events and subplots. The team spared no effort in surprising the player, even breaking established boundaries by featuring NPCs that looked suspiciously like Mario and Kirby characters, sometimes without permission from the other development teams. This more casual approach to development eventually led to ideas like a fishing minigame designed by Morita, who was fond of fishing as a hobby and programmed that into the game without being asked. Fishing would eventually go on to be present in nearly every Legend of Zelda game going forward. Without realizing it, Morita, Koizumi, Tanabe, and Tezuka were establishing the template for all the Legend of Zelda games that would follow, particularly the tendency to draw inspiration from Twin Peaks and the idea of characters with an air of mystery about them. I'm certain it was an important element in the series making a breakthrough, Eiji Aonuma would say years later. If we had proceeded from A Link to the Past straight to Ocarina without Link's Awakening in between, Ocarina would have been different. And I would personally argue that, in that same way, Ocarina of Time would have been different without Marvelous Another Treasure Island. Much like a certain other Nintendo game, Marvelous wasn't allowed to release outside of Japan. So, you watching this video can be forgiven for not knowing about it. But yes, this was Aonuma's first directed game that he created with the Link to the Past engine, inspired by Link's Awakening. Aonuma made Marvelous in a collaboration with HAL Laboratories, and specifically Satoru Iwata. Much like Link's Awakening, Marvelous is a short story about a strange island. You play as 4 boys who explore the island's secrets, find the treasure at the end of the secrets, and you fight the pirates, because they're the one who stole the treasure. Really a simple idea, it's more about what Aonuma does with it. One of the first things you'll probably notice is how much of this game's multi-character control mechanics would show up again in Four Swords, which is a pretty cool point of comparison. It shows that when Aonuma says that Four Swords is one of the games that takes place between Skyward and Ocarina, that it's connected because it was something that was important to him to show the adventure between 4 boys and how it could tangentially relate with the other mechanics he's introduced, like weighted platforms. Weighted platforms are actually going to be important later, too. The second thing you'll probably notice about Marvelous is that it's heavily inspired by Mother 2, Earthbound. Marvelous has a ton of cues from Earthbound. It's unmistakable. Now, this is one of the only times in the video where I will fully admit to be speculating, but, like, wow, how could you not? This has never been mentioned before or after, but apparently, before Marvelous, Iwata and Aonuma actually worked on a game together, which never released. This is before he officially joined Nintendo or anything, and I should say, this is very in character for Iwata, but if I said more than that, this video would be, like, way longer than it already is. But it's interesting because we also know that Earthbound 64 began development around this exact same time. And the whole reason Mother even exists in the first place is because Atoy had a relationship with Iwata. So suddenly Marvelous having all this Earthbound stuff in it suddenly doesn't seem so trivial. And soon when we get to Ocarina, you can see that he's already built up a rapport with Koizumi's story ideas from A Link to the Past manual, and he also took control of the whole Ocarina team very quickly. Like, by Space World, they had already completed arguably most of the dungeons. It's hard to say what influence Aonuma had on all of that. Like, here's a quote. He's talking with Takizawa, and the way he's worded it makes it sound like he worked on A Link to the Past. Maybe that's not what he meant, but this whole situation and what this game could have been is actually something I haven't seen brought up anywhere else. I mean, seriously, how am I the first person to talk about most of this stuff? Isn't Zelda like an extremely popular game series? Of course, Miyamoto has never directly stated his distaste for Link's Awakening. He wouldn't really be allowed to express dissenting views about the company like that. But he did give this interview in 1994, 2 years after Link's Awakening came out, so right before Ocarina began development. The context of this interview is that there's a series of high-profile game developers in Japan, and this publication wanted to collect as many as they could to cast a broader net and inspire readers to become video game developers themselves. The first interview listed is Yuji Hora's, the director of Dragon Quest. And I'm sure the tone of what Miyamoto has to say here was because he felt a little bit upstaged by that. But again, I'm bringing it up here because it clearly applies to Link's Awakening. At Nintendo, we get many letters with stories and designs from kids asking to make such and such a game. However, most of them are just imitating Mario and Dragon Quest, and only the stories are different. But thinking up a story and setting is not the main part of game design. If you only change the surface experience, you haven't changed anything. It's often said that the heart of the game is the story, but that's not the case. The story comes only after the core of the game system is completed. Then the characters come into focus, and the world starts to manifest. Two siblings separated at birth are reunited. I can't call that a game design. There's no backstory to Mario, after all. On the other hand, if someone came to me with a proposal for a new system, like that of the game SimCity, that would probably catch my attention. Without that, game design is just a game of make-believe. I don't mean to speak negatively about using your imagination like that, of course, but there's no need for young, aspiring designers to do that. What's important is starting from the fundamentals. I don't think that Miyamoto was particularly bitter about Dragon's Quest or Link's Awakening. Obviously, we'll never know for sure, but either way, Miyamoto's perspective here is one with which all other developers and all other Nintendo developers, not just producers, but people who actually worked on the game design, disagree with. Zelda, as we know it today, it exists and was born out of spite for Miyamoto and out of spite for this specific perspective that he has. So the fact that you see almost the entire spectrum of Zelda fanboys on the internet using him as an appeal to authority, especially when talking about how they don't like Skyward Sword, is probably one of the most damning things. All the way back in 1995, Miyamoto hasn't been involved with Zelda or Mario at this point for 8 years. 8 years ago was when I started speedrunning Night of 100 Frights. 8 years is a lifetime, dude. Miyamoto's only credits after this is as producer.
Sind Sie immer noch so kreativ wie früher?
Das ist eine Sache, die mir Sorgen macht. Die Budgets sind enorm. Hier bei Nintendo sind die Summen für die Entwicklung einer Software quasi unbegrenzt. Wenn ich selbstständig wäre, könnte ich mir das nicht leisten, ohne große Risiken einzugehen. Das macht mir ein wenig Angst. Stimmt schon. Manchmal frage ich mich selbst, ob ich nun Manager bin oder Kreativer.
Production on video games, and especially retro games, which were insanely low budget by today's standards, it's just a paycheck. You're not involved with any of the decision making, and you certainly aren't the originator for the ideas that get put into the final product. Like Miyamoto says himself, he's not really involved. And again, that's fine in and of itself. I'm sure Miyamoto is a passionate businessman, but to crutch on his authority as if he's some kind of savant shows that you just don't know a single thing about Nintendo or how they've ever made games. To this day, he remains the most popular game developer of all time solely for these interviews on games that he had next to zero involvement in, and people just continue to not research a single thing about him. It shows that when people talk about or even advocate for video games, what they're advocating for, 9 times out of 10, is a very symbolic and ritualistic thing. They see Miyamoto in an advertisement or at E3 or whatever, and just assume that he did everything. That's the end of the story. No need to read Famitsu, and now I can pretend that I care about video games because I name dropped him. The state of video game commentary is pathetic, and I refuse to tolerate it anymore because I know we're better than this. At this point, I think I've demonstrated that Link's Awakening team had a deep synergy with each other, which is a little more than tangentially related to Aonuma's directed games, as this would be the team he worked with in his earliest titles, but also artists like Satoru Takezawa would become Aonuma's most irreplaceable collaborators, and each deserve their own little spotlights like I already gave Morita and Koizumi. But I think it would surprise a lot of people just how small Aonuma's role in Ocarina itself really was. This game became very important to Aonuma retroactively, but at the time, had Ocarina completed development without his inclusion? I'd like to make the argument that the story would still be mostly intact. As we established before, Mr. Koizumi was the one responsible for a lot of Link to the Past, and especially Link's Awakening. The first thing to understand about Koizumi's conception of The Legend of Zelda is that it's all deliberately childlike. Ocarina especially depicts child Zelda as a childhood playmate. She's like his sister or his best friend, basically. In later Aonuma games, the spirit of this would split from Zelda into Aryll from Wind Waker, or Ilia from Twilight Princess. You'll learn a lot about Koizumi's life if you read Rosalina's storybook from Mario Galaxy. But actually, you'll notice this story is eerily similar to the one told to you by Angie's grandmother. The story is illustrated like an oil painting. You'll notice even down to the library and the campfire. This is very autobiographical. You can't depict something like this without having lived it.
Let us begin.
The story in both cases is a story about a child wanting to find their family, but along the way they create a new family among their playmates. There's just a lot going on here that nobody really talks about, but Koizumi directed both of these games. This is just very obviously him. I think a big fingerprint of Koizumi's is these anthropomorphized objects that he has an extension of the level design and vice versa. Piantas having palm trees on their heads and then living on top of a giant palm tree is one. Bombs are living bombs and they live in a battlefield is another. Here you have kind of a rock people who live next to a volcano, rocky terrain, and they also eat rocks. The Zelda Wiki honestly gets this one wrong. If anything, Koizumi's using Mario and Zelda interchangeably. Gorons are right in line with this design sensibility. Koizumi doesn't really care who the player character is or what the branding happens to be attached to it is, because he's designing these creatures independent of those concepts. Again, Koizumi is a storyteller, and Mario is a brand that he's mandated to work with. Any adherence to Mario's philosophy is a mistake, nothing more, which is why Sunshine is his most complete work. You'll notice Ganon and the Sages have been overhauled too. A big part of this shows up at the end of the game, which of course needs to reflect Link to the Past so that you have a real understanding of how this works as a prequel. It's important to remember also that Koizumi created Ganondorf in the Link to the Past manual as a backstory for Ganon. In 1995, the game that they were making was an attempt to adapt that on screen. At this point, the Gerudo don't actually exist. Ganondorf doesn't have a backstory. He is the backstory already. So with Koizumi coming up with different races and doing the animations and stuff, Takezawa would be there to flesh out things a little bit, bounce ideas off of him and the artwork, and we would have a very solid foundation for Ocarina. The only thing missing is Aonuma's level design, since Takashi Tezuka was struggling using a 3D editor. Tezuka, very obviously, being extremely familiar with 2D editors, is now outside of his comfort zone. Aonuma is assigned to the Ocarina of Time team at the absolute earliest, late 1996, initially as a level designer. The technology, including the ones for level creation, were almost completely unprecedented. The only person in the room who had experience with the engine and the editor would have been Koizumi, as he was making Mario 64 simultaneous with Ocarina. So this is where Koizumi and Aonuma officially begin to become very close. Aonuma would have had to shadow Koizumi in order to learn how the software works, and as any co-workers do, they bond over making fun of their boss behind his back. But it turned out Aonuma was a natural 3D level designer, which he later attributes to his past working on Kakakuri puppets, which, by the way, isn't a throwaway detail, because the articulation of Kakakuri puppets is controlled by a series of switches and strings. In a 3D game, all the entities are always scripted out to function in one way, but by linking different scripts to different entities, the artist creates a profound illusion that the player is interacting with a living, breathing environment. Level design is working the same way that a Kakakuri puppet would. The exterior is a cute diorama, and inside are these simple controlled mechanisms, and being able to see how both work in tandem is what makes level designers truly great. This, of course, isn't Aonuma's only skill in this department, but for now I will digress. At the same time, this cleanly reveals Aonuma's story contributions to Ocarina of Time. Aonuma's dungeons and the entities that you're required to interface with are scripted and integrated deeply with the cutscenes, character animations, and dialogue. There's really no way to have programmed a scenario like carrying Princess Ruto around without also having developed this character who sees herself as someone who deserves to be carried. It's just one of those things that naturally comes up as a designer. You read into these situations, and putting your imagination into it isn't an optional part of it, and it isn't removable, like quality of life randomizer speedruns to remove dialogue. If you're someone who cares about this medium, things like that should really piss you off. It's erasing presentation. It's not how the game was meant to be seen, it's vandalism. These characters, their dialogue, are intrinsically baked into every single dungeon. The Deku Tree and Jabu Jabu aren't just levels, they are themselves characters in the story. Aonuma's official job was level designer at this point, but the personal goal that he made for himself was to flesh out the sages, which, the big picture takeaway, is that Link now has a relationship to the sages. Something that, before, Koizumi hadn't considered. And this ambition of Aonuma's promoted him to co-director alongside Koizumi. The most important theme here is about Link's emotional vulnerability. The sages are much more than simple chiefs and leaders of tribes like Womp King or King Bob-omb. Now they actually have a personality and a relationship with Link. And I shouldn't need to say this, but really all these archetypes, but especially Princess Ruto, would later go on to expand into characters like Tattle, Tetra, and Midna, which we're going to see later. The Gerudo weren't really part of that, though. Instead, they come into play simply because Aonuma just likes pirates. Aonuma's affinity for pirates is going to be something that'll keep coming up again and again, but at this point he's already created Marvelous, wherein the main antagonists are pirates, and the main mechanic is driving a pirate ship. So when Aonuma was briefed on the story at this point, and he learns that Ganon was stealing the power of the gods, he simply supposed, oh, what if he was the leader of a band of pirates? Of course, an N64 game wouldn't be able to support something like an ocean, so he compromises. The rolling dunes of a desert look enough like ocean waves, so they became desert thieves. Remember, at this point, Ganon was really associated with fire, not the desert. So, if anything, his headquarters would have been Death Mountain, which is the case in several other Zelda games where they couldn't make room for a desert in the map, like Four Swords. And this is also evidenced by simply comparing Ganon's backstory from Ocarina of Time to the one in A Link to the Past. The one thing that's missing is the desert, and the one person on the development team that's missing is Aonuma. Ocarina of Time says he's a wicked man from the desert. This is completely absent from Link to the Past manual. Again, because this is Aonuma's idea. Aonuma wanted to flesh out Ganondorf's lineage, and show where Ganondorf came from. And when we end Ocarina of Time, the very first thing I want to talk about is the part of the story Aonuma wanted to tell next, which is what happens to the Gerudo next. This is what he was primarily interested in. Alright, another weird placeholder. So basically, the way I want all of these to work is to go over development history and then go over story relevant stuff. This is where I would put Ocarina's story relevant stuff, but of course, Ocarina has a lot in it that would sort of become more important retroactively and was less so at the time. It's hard to prove what Aonuma knew at this time and what's a later revision, but I think it stands to reason that he knew more than zero, which is the case I'm going to make, but as it stands, no, I don't have everything straightened out for this yet, sorry. To begin Majora's Mask, I'm going to tell you a story that you may already be familiar with, but I believe the gravity of which hasn't been fully appreciated really by anyone. Majora is by far the most rushed and unfinished of Aonuma's directed Zelda games, and I'm not going to pretend to be the first person to tell that story. Actually, the first person to tell that story was Aonuma himself. I'm not just talking about interviews, actually, because the game itself, at many different points, is brimming with meta-commentary and criticism of Nintendo corporate. Once again, none of which are disputable in any way, it's just the obvious intention of the artist who created the game. The way Aonuma tells this story, it sounds like he was trying to pull his own weight with Miyamoto. But that just doesn't make any sense. It really makes far, far more sense that this diversion from Master Quest into Zelda Gaiden was somewhat gradual. Aonuma would have tried to make a compromise between the two. Obviously, he had his reservations at this point, but he wasn't about to deliberately make those known. That could be risking his job. We only know about his reservations from things he's admitted retroactively. So, what Aonuma wanted and tried to do instead was a more liberal approach to Miyamoto's instructions. What I'm going to propose to you is something really pretty simple, which is that Ocarina and Majora at one point were just one game. At some arbitrary point, the team decided that they had enough material to round out the experience and decided to cut their worm in half, the other half becoming its own worm. As Aonuma's explained several times, the genesis of what we now know as Majora's Mask began in response to when Master Quest began development. Again, while I say all this, bear in mind what I said before. Separate titles very rarely represent separate periods of work. When we're talking about Nintendo and its developers reacting to any kind of failure or success, understand this reaction is at an incredible delay. By the time they learn how well the game did critically or even financially, the developers are already halfway through making the sequel. Let's first look at the company, the big picture of Nintendo. As I've said before, this is what Miyamoto was primarily focused on instead of individual titles, which had been his role on staff since Zelda 2. Of course, originally the N64 was not the plan for the next big home console by Nintendo at all. The Nintendo PlayStation was their original attempt at a disc-based system, ultimately failing and splintering. By the end of it, there were two surviving splinters, the 64DD and the Philips CDI, both of which were commercial failures, all in their own merits. But what was way worse for Nintendo was that the only phoenix rising from those ashes was the Sony PlayStation. Nintendo essentially created the PlayStation as we know it. And in their greed, they also rebuked any reward that they could have gotten from that investment. Nintendo's also getting kicked while they're down because they just got finished having their ass handed to them by Sega. The Nintendo 64 might have a huge cult following today, but the realities at the time just were very different. And I'm trying to put this into perspective. It shouldn't be controversial to say that without the Wii, the company really could have gone bankrupt. The importance of Ocarina of Time's success at this time, to both Miyamoto and to Aonuma, cannot be understated. Both of these men took it in their own directions, which I'll describe now. Miyamoto's focus was a second quest for Ocarina, most likely planned to ship with the retail game, or at the very least still release in some form or fashion on the N64 console. But as we all know, any plans like that fell through. Eventually the efforts for the N64 DD were put into the GameCube instead as the Master Quest. Far too little too late. Aonuma's focus was very different though. In his eyes, the point of a sequel would have been to make a sequel to the story of the game, to continue the story. And Aonuma's biggest contribution to Ocarina of Time's story were the Gerudo. I think it makes a lot of sense that his plans for a sequel would have been to expand their backstory more in the next game. It was very simple and straightforward. He just wanted to tell more of the Gerudo's story, not much else. This proper sequel to Ocarina of Time is eventually what would spawn into the entire 3D Zelda series as we know it today. You know, if you're looking at all the promotional material for Majora, Twilight Princess, Wind Waker, they're all described on at least one box or in at least one magazine as the sequel to Ocarina of Time. You'd be very correct to wonder how they could all be a sequel to the same game simultaneously. What was necessary for the rest of the Gerudo's story obviously changed over time, and we're going to get into that, but in Aonuma's mind in 1999, it was really just going to be one game, not 4 like it ended up being. He was also less picky about it at this time, and he just didn't think it'd be that difficult to make. Aonuma's way of compromising between Master Quest and just making a new Zelda game was to create new areas which could conceivably populate Hyrule. This is all that Zelda Gaiden really was. Just DLC to put new load zones on Ocarina of Time's map. This makes a lot of sense when you look at how the game's main 4 areas are split out in the final game. You don't go straight from Termina Field to Romani Ranch. You have to pass through Milk Road. You don't go straight through Termina Field to the Goron Shrine. You have to go through the Mountain Passage. These short transitional areas are being placed here like this as a way of splintering the map. And it's clear evidence, again, that these were originally meant to populate Hyrule, not Termina, because N64 maps always taper like this to mask load zones. These transitional areas are also extremely reminiscent of how Aonuma would approach overworlds in Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword. These are the kinds of areas, older fans really love hating on. They insist up and down, these maps make the game too linear, whatever that means. But here they are, all the way back in Majora's Mask. This linearity just isn't new or unique to the later entries. It's something clearly defined early on in the series, and better emphasized over time, the same way that every series in fiction works. It's simply the artist refining his thoughts. But anyway, with this DLC installed, there'd be a new loading zone in Kokiri Forest, and when you walk into it, it takes you to Southern Swamp. Because, if you look later at how Twilight Princess map is constructed, what do you see? Faron Woods has purple poison in it. Oh wait, that's Southern Swamp. Snowy Mountains branching out from Zora's domain? Suddenly you realize it's Snowhead. It was always meant that these places in Majora were extensions of Hyrule, only retroactively were they reconfigured into Termina. But okay, how did we get to Termina? Well, Aonuma pitches this concept to Miyamoto, and Miyamoto instantly misinterprets it as a version to his plan. He says, well, if you're going to make your own game, you can, but I'm only giving you a year to do it. Aonuma's goal wasn't to make a new game at this point. He just wanted a Master Quest to be a little more than an inconsequential asset swap. Now he's stuck with this monkey paw deal, and a game where he can't possibly deliver on. So he rushes back over to Koizumi for help. Koizumi is also sick of putting up with Miyamoto's shit, and he just wants to be able to make his own game for once. Aonuma respects that, and he agrees. Termina is Koizumi's creation, most specifically Clocktown. There's 2 separate interviews I'm going to use to prove that, but I'm just too lazy right now, to be honest with you. But yeah, Koizumi wanted NPC schedules and all that stuff. Termina explicitly does not have some magical separate history from Hyrule. It's just happenstance of the way the game ended up. Originally, it was just meant to be Hyrule. The only reason we don't view Majora's Mask as a spin-off game today is because the experiment actually succeeded, and Aonuma was able to keep making Zelda games. And as soon as he did, the first thing he did was reincorporate those areas back into Hyrule's map. It's just not a mystery. When we get to Wind Waker, that whole section is going to be written around Aonuma's new approach to overworld design, and about how you were meant to descend into the surface, not just to grab the Master Sword, but also to reach the entrance to the Earth and Wind Temples, which would have been done with a mechanic with a fishing rod and of some kind shown in this concept art. In the final game, there's simply a pit at the dungeon entrance to give you the impression that the dungeons are built under the surface of the water. As we're going to see, this concept would finally be successfully executed with Skyward Sword's surface in the sky. Because Skyward Sword is just the perfection of Aonuma's vision. I don't know what else anyone could possibly want more. Another thread to follow here is how Princess Ruto, Tattle, Tetra, Midna, they're all part of this archetype Aonuma is interested in, of a female character who slowly warms up to Link over time. I think Aonuma probably didn't like that Zelda in Ocarina of Time wasn't the least bit skeptical of Link after he just infiltrated the castle to get to her. It's kind of like ludonarrative dissonance. But Koizumi did make Zelda naive and enthusiastic on purpose. Another thing important to discuss is how Aonuma and Ueda's relationship began. Wind Waker is also the introduction of the bird people, the Rito, which is an idea that Aonuma got from the Ocarina of Time manga, but he uses it here for his own purposes, in the same way that he's co-opting all these symbols and worlds and characters. It's hard to conceptualize this, because it's so well thought out, but Aonuma didn't create most of the things he's working with. Koizumi came up with Ganondorf, Miyamoto came up with Princess Zelda, but to pretend like these things are exactly the same way they were when they were first created is just to completely miss what Aonuma is doing. The Rito, for example, are connected to the Oku from Twilight Princess, which eventually connects into the Loftwings and Skyloft, which, this whole time the Loftwing was always depicted on the Hylian shield, so that goes all the way back to Ocarina of Time. It's a big thing that shows you Aonuma's thinking, and it shows you how he uses other people's ideas in a transformative and comprehensive way. Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword are going to be the longest parts of Section 3, because there's a lot going on with the architecture and the level design. I know there were comments asking me to talk about level design more. I'm reserving those for Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, because the level design, it stacks up a lot more when they're poetically referencing each other on certain things. The cutscenes also have a bunch of poetry behind them, the dialogue. I plan to fully expose all that stuff. If you want, I already have a list of poetic quotation across all the Zelda games. I think I'm just going to start inserting it straight into this video. Later I will integrate these clips more seamlessly, but they're important, so I'll just show them all now.
And Link was going to wake up on the day of his guardian fairy bestowing ceremony.
You little cock. I use the Yula called the lawyer. Was you the Ulas also? Few hours is good. Equal Kizado you Lola.
Should eat the pig. You need you open. One good thing big.
你再次连连给我爱慕而剧痛，以你开的手机，そして你连开在我有意。
Before it could end. From what will be? What city takes me? Plus one shooting time. What's like a floor here? Gem ink mess. What ends? Would that champion to us? A champion who can do this. The world house. What you don't?
娘应该无意识，娘谁根就是썩 희뉴사시 이후 건사
Je vois du rail le dos. Le coquelot, il y homme.
The first thing I want to tell you about in my discussion of Zelda-esqueness is an extremely important process that is inseparably connected to Zelda development, and that is something I call the Miyamoto test, also known as upending the tea table. The Chabudai tea table is a low dining table in which you sit on the floor to eat at, but you don't see them often nowadays, as most Japanese families eat at Western-style dining tables. But when I was growing up in the 1950s through the 1970s, every house had one. So what it means to upend the tea table It actually comes from a scene from a famous Japanese manga called Star of the Giants, in which the father, seated and back there on the left, hits his son in front of him so hard that the food on the table is knocked up into the air. Now, the father, being in no mood to eat what's been served, upended the table, forcing his wife to cook a new meal. This action by the head of the household was absolute and represents the action of an old-fashioned Japanese father. Of course, nowadays, if someone was to do that, it would actually destroy the family, and the father would be arrested for child abuse. So all that remains today is this phrase of upending the tea table. So long ago, there was a period where, in Japan, they thought this was proper and acceptable. Nowadays, with only the phrase remaining, generally what happens is the leader figure takes on the role of the strong, proper father. Whenever a game nears completion, with only the final polishing remaining, without fail, Mr. Miyamoto upends our tea table, and the direction that we all thought we were going in suddenly changes dramatically. After finishing work on Ocarina of Time, Mr. Miyamoto instructed us to use the Ocarina of Time engine to create Ura Zelda, a very typical Zelda series second version with rearranged dungeon gameplay. But I felt that just changing around the puzzle solving without changing the overall structure of the game would be too limiting. So I turned down Mr. Miyamoto's offer and proposed that, if anything, I wanted to make a new Zelda game. So even now, Mr. Miyamoto still scolds me for being the lazy type of guy who comes to conclusions before even giving something a try.
Well, as I said last year at E3, I was introduced as the producer of this title, and over the course of the year, we've worked obviously on development. And then I took it to Mr. Miyamoto, and I showed him what we had come up with. And of course, Mr. Miyamoto, in typical Mr. Miyamoto fashion, took the tea table and tipped it over on his. So, as my job, or Mr. Aonuma's job, of course, then is to put the tea table back in order, and doing so, it's more of a hands-on director content job. So that's pretty much what he's doing now. So Mr. Miyamoto's job is to clean up together, to help Mr. Aonuma put the tea table back in order. And it's a very enjoyable job. It's having a great time doing it.
But Mr. Miyamoto doesn't just upend the tea table and send the team into utter confusion. He then sits down with us, and together we rethink what we have done that has been effective, and what we can do that will create a positive result for a Zelda game. So Mr. Miyamoto always says that when it comes to upending the tea table, I always pick up my own plate. So his test is very important, and it is something that we actually welcome.